My son looked at me across the dinner table and demanded I sell my house to cover his $500,000 debt. When I calmly asked why he did not sell his own mansion first, his wife scoffed and called my home a decaying relic. They left a folder on my table thinking I would surrender. What they did not know was that the quiet old man they were trying to institutionalize was about to dismantle their entire lives. My name is Gregory. I am 69 years old, and for the longest time I believed I had raised a son who understood the value of hard work and respect. Before I tell you exactly how I taught him a lesson he will never forget, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The silver fork clattered against the fine china, breaking the heavy silence of the dining room. Emily pushed her half-eaten plate of roasted lamb away with a visible shudder. She crossed her arms, her gaze sweeping over the intricate crown molding and the vintage brass chandelier that hung above us. She sighed loudly, stating that the historic fixtures in my home were depressingly outdated and completely devoid of modern appeal. She openly criticized the mahogany dining table we sat at, a piece I had carefully restored with my late wife Cynthia decades ago. To Emily, the rich polished wood was just another sign of my stubborn refusal to embrace the current century. Jordan sat next to her, swirling the red wine in his glass without meeting my eyes. The tension in the room was a living, breathing entity, suffocating and sharp. I continued cutting my meat, maintaining my composure. I had learned long ago that reacting to Emily's calculated provocations only gave her the attention she craved. My home was an immaculate piece of mid-century architecture in a rapidly gentrifying urban neighborhood maintained with absolute precision. Yet she spoke of it as if it were a condemned building. I took a slow sip of water, waiting for the real reason behind this sudden Sunday dinner visit. They never came to my house simply to share a meal. Every visit was a transaction, an opportunity for them to assess what I had and what they felt they were owed. Jordan finally cleared his throat, placing his wine glass firmly on the table. He adjusted his expensive tailored suit jacket, a physical manifestation of a success he did not actually possess. He looked at me, his face tight with a desperation he attempted to mask with authority. His tech startup was failing. He delivered this news not as a confession of defeat, but as an inconvenience that I was obligated to resolve. He stated flatly that the company was bleeding capital and that he was facing a catastrophic deficit. He owed $500,000 to a consortium of private lenders. He did not ask for a loan. He did not ask for advice. He leaned across the mahogany table and demanded that I sell my house to cover his debt. He framed this egregious demand as a father's fundamental duty to secure his son's future. He argued that a single man of my age had no logical reason to occupy a property sitting on a double lot in a premium district. He insisted the equity in my home was idle capital that belonged in the hands of the next generation. I looked at the boy I had raised. I thought of the countless sacrifices Cynthia and I had made to ensure he attended the best universities, graduating completely debt-free. I did not shout. I did not strike the table or express my profound disappointment. I carefully placed my fork down, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the placemat. I met his desperate gaze with absolute calm. I asked him a simple, devastating question. Why do you not sell your 6-bedroom estate in the suburbs? You have a pristine property with a heated pool, a multi-car garage, and a sprawling lawn. Liquidate your own assets to cover your own failures. The silence that followed my question was absolute. Jordan blinked, stunned that I had rejected his demand with such clinical precision. He had expected me to panic, to weep, to offer my life savings on a silver platter. He had severely miscalculated my boundaries. Emily scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound that shattered the quiet. She leaned forward, her face flushed with indignation. She stated that their suburban mansion was a vital investment, a necessary asset to project stability to their social circle and future investors. She called my historic home a decaying relic, taking up valuable land, a burdensome property that was entirely wasted on a retired old man. Jordan reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. He tossed it onto the center of the table. It slid across the polished wood, stopping inches from my plate. He announced that these were preliminary real estate documents. He commanded me to review them, sign them by the end of the week, and prepare to move into an assisted living apartment they had generously selected for me. They stood up in unison, leaving their meal unfinished, and marched out of my front door without another word. The heavy oak door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the profound silence of my dining room. I did not rush to the window to watch them drive away. I calmly reached for the manila folder. I flipped past the aggressive, artificially low property appraisal they had commissioned without my consent. I pulled out the secondary documents hidden near the back. My blood ran cold, but my mind sharpened to a razor edge. Beneath the real estate contracts was a medical evaluation form from a private psychiatric clinic. The intake fields were already filled out in Emily's precise handwriting. It was a formal petition to declare me mentally incompetent due to severe cognitive decline. They were not merely asking me to sell my home. They were actively constructing a legal framework to strip me of my autonomy, seize my property by force, and lock me in a facility. They believed I was a frail, ignorant old man ripe for the slaughter. They had no idea that they had just declared war on a man who owned the very ground they walked on. The heavy oak front door slammed shut, sending a faint vibration through the polished floorboards of my study. I remained completely still, listening to the aggressive roar of Jordan's luxury sedan speeding out of my driveway. I sat alone in the dim light, surrounded by the scent of old leather and the dense silence of an empty house. I did not weep. Tears are a luxury reserved for those who have the privilege of surprise, and I had seen the cold calculation in my son's eyes long before tonight. I picked up the medical evaluation form they had left on the dining table. My name was printed at the top in Emily's flawless, slanted handwriting. Diagnosis pending severe cognitive decline. It was not a medical document. It was a declaration of war. They genuinely believed I was a frail, ignorant old man ripe for the slaughter. I placed the paper flat on my desk and reached for my secure landline. I bypassed my standard contacts and dialed a number strictly from memory. Jonathan answered on the second ring. He was not a man who observed traditional office hours. Jonathan had been my corporate attorney and wealth manager for over 2 decades, a brilliant legal mind who operated with the exact same quiet precision I demanded of myself. I did not exchange pleasantries. I told him my son had just demanded I liquidate my estate to cover a $500,000 deficit. I told him about the psychiatric hold form. Jonathan did not offer empty platitudes or express shock. He simply asked for my instructions. I told him to initiate a forensic audit of Jordan's tech startup and all associated personal accounts immediately. I needed to know exactly what kind of fire my son was trying to put out using my home as an extinguisher. Jordan and Emily operated under the absolute assumption that I was surviving on a modest dispatcher's pension and the equity of this historic property. They believed my financial ceiling was reached the day Cynthia and I finally paid off our mortgage. They knew absolutely nothing of the reality. Decades ago, when the city's commercial shipping ports faced a catastrophic recession, I did not retreat into fear. As an African-American man in a ruthless industry, I knew opportunities were not given, they were taken. I leveraged everything I had, risking total ruin to purchase a fleet of abandoned commercial cargo vessels for pennies on the dollar. I rebuilt those rust buckets into a massive regional logistics and commercial real estate empire. I operated strictly through blind trusts and holding companies. I amassed wealth, silently shielding my family from the corrupting influence of unearned money. I wanted Jordan to build his own legacy, to understand the profound weight and value of honest labor. Instead, he had grown to resent the very foundation of my restraint, mistaking my humility for weakness. By sunrise the next morning, Jonathan was sitting across from me in my study, a thick bound dossier resting on his lap. He did not bring coffee. He brought ruinous facts. The audit was complete, executed with ruthless efficiency by his private financial team. Jordan's tech startup was not a victim of market fluctuations, economic downturns, or bad timing. It was a hollow shell, a bleeding artery of gross negligence. Jonathan opened the dossier and spread the financial ledgers across my desk. He stated that the $500,000 deficit was not a simple business failure. Jordan was drowning in a sophisticated web of predatory loans. He had illegally leveraged the startup operating capital to cover catastrophic escalating losses in underground sports betting. He was bleeding money to dangerous people who did not respect corporate bankruptcy laws. The remaining funds had been systematically drained to subsidize Emily's exorbitant lifestyle. I looked at the itemized expenses highlighted in yellow. There were astronomical monthly payments for exotic car leases they rarely drove. There were private country club memberships they used exclusively to network with people they secretly despised. There were 6-figure credit card bills from luxury boutiques in Paris and Milan. They were living like billionaires while drowning in a $500,000 sinkhole of their own making. They were bankrupting themselves to maintain an illusion of superiority, and they expected me to sacrifice the home I built with my late wife to maintain their artificial kingdom. Jonathan remained quiet, allowing me to process the sheer magnitude of my son's recklessness, but his expression remained tight, signaling that the worst of the audit had yet to be revealed. He placed one final document on the center of my desk, separating it from the rest of the financial wreckage. He stated that the gambling debts and the frivolous spending were only the symptoms of a much darker, far more desperate disease. He instructed me to examine the signature line on the document. It was a preliminary intake form for a high-risk commercial bridge loan. The principal amount requested was exactly $2 million. I scanned the collateral section of the application. Jordan had not used his own sprawling suburban estate to secure the funding. He had listed my historic home. He had initiated a process to leverage the very roof over my head to secure a massive influx of cash, attempting to placate the violent men holding his gambling markers and inject phantom equity back into his failing company. I looked at the bottom of the page. My name was signed in blue ink. The curve of the G and the sharp slope of the Y were perfectly replicated. My son had forged my signature to initiate a fraudulent lien against my property. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice a low, clinical whisper. He explained that the lender was not a standard bank but an aggressive commercial equity firm. They were demanding physical verification of the property and the signatory by Friday. Jordan needed me out of the house and legally incapacitated before the assessors arrived. He needed to lock me away in an assisted living facility, not out of misplaced concern for my mental health, but to eliminate the sole witness to a federal crime. If I were declared legally incompetent, Jordan would gain immediate power of attorney. He could sign the final verification documents himself, finalize the $2 million theft, and bulldoze my home without consequence. I stared at the forged ink on the page. The deep aching pain of a father's betrayal evaporated instantly, replaced by an absolute glacial clarity. My son had crossed the line from disrespect into criminality. He had placed a target on my back to save his own skin. I looked at Jonathan and closed the dossier. I told him to contact Daniel, our lead private investigator. I told Jonathan to prepare the corporate accounts for an immediate hostile acquisition. I was not going to run. I was not going to hide. I was going to let my son believe he had won, right up until the moment I tore his fraudulent world apart. I finalized my instructions with Jonathan and immediately placed a secondary call to a man named Daniel. Daniel operated entirely in the shadows of the city's corporate underbelly, a private investigator who specialized in forensic surveillance and opposition research. He did not ask questions regarding my motives. I provided him with Jordan and Emily's home address, the license plate numbers of their leased luxury vehicles, and a simple directive to monitor their physical movements and digital communications around the clock. I needed to know who they were meeting, what they were planning, and exactly how desperate they had become. With the surveillance protocol initiated, I forced myself to maintain the rigid routine of a retired, unassuming man. I drove my 10-year-old sedan to the local farmer's market. I purchased fresh collard greens, smoked turkey necks, and a pound of dark roast coffee, moving through the aisles with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had absolutely nothing pressing on his schedule. It was vital that I project complete ignorance. I pulled back into my driveway just after noon. The illusion of my peaceful morning shattered the moment I shifted the car into park. A silver luxury crossover belonging to my daughter-in-law sat idling against the curb. Parked directly behind it, blocking my garage, was a white commercial utility van bearing no company logo. I picked up my grocery bags and walked up the cobblestone path, my senses heightened to every sound echoing from within my own property. I slid my key into the front door, but the lock was already disengaged. I stepped into the foyer and was immediately met with the sharp mechanical click of a camera shutter. I walked toward the archway of the living room and found a strange man in heavy work boots standing on my Persian rug, photographing the structural load-bearing columns. Emily stood near the fireplace, casually flipping through a magazine. From her manicured fingers dangled the heavy brass spare key. It was the emergency key my late wife Cynthia had given to Jordan a decade ago, with the strict instruction that it was only to be used if I were injured or incapacitated. Emily had not knocked. She had not called. She had simply let herself and a stranger into my sanctuary. Emily noticed my reflection in the hallway mirror and spun around, a bright, entirely artificial smile stretching across her face. She stepped forward, tossing the magazine onto the coffee table with a theatrical sigh. She immediately launched into a rehearsed narrative, claiming she had taken the liberty of bringing over a premier interior decorator to assess the property. She insisted the housing market was shifting rapidly, and she wanted to gather professional advice on how to modernize my vintage aesthetic for a quick, lucrative sale. She spoke to me with the slow, exaggerated enunciation one might use when addressing a confused child, completely ignoring the sheer audacity of her trespassing. I did not drop my groceries. I did not raise my voice or express outrage at the violation of my privacy. I bypassed her entirely and focused my attention on the stranger. I observed the heavy canvas bag resting at his feet. It contained a laser distance meter structural calipers and a high-grade topographical mapping lens. An interior decorator examines paint swatches and fabric textiles. This man was measuring the exact square footage and structural integrity of the foundational walls. I set my bags on the floor and stepped into his personal space. I demanded his professional identification. The man froze, lowering his camera. He looked nervously toward Emily, waiting for her to intervene and shield him. Emily stepped between us, her voice tightening with a sudden edge of panic. She told me I was becoming agitated over a simple favor, attempting to gaslight me in my own living room by insisting I had previously agreed to this assessment and simply forgotten the conversation. I did not break eye contact with the intruder. I extended my hand, palm up, and informed him that he was currently committing a criminal trespass and that I would involve law enforcement in exactly 10 seconds if he did not produce a corporate credential. The man swallowed hard, reached into his chest pocket, and handed me a laminated card. The bold lettering did not belong to a design studio. He was a senior commercial land surveyor for a massive urban development firm. I slipped the card into my pocket. I turned my attention back to Emily. The false smile had vanished from her face, replaced by a rigid mask of defensive anger. I extended my hand toward her. I did not ask for an apology. I demanded the brass key. She gripped it tightly, arguing that Jordan had given it to her and that it was their legal right to access the property as my designated caretakers. I stepped closer, closing the distance until she was forced to look up into my eyes. I informed her that she had exactly 3 seconds to surrender the key before I had her physically removed from the premises. Her arrogance faltered under the absolute icy authority of my gaze. She dropped the key into my palm. I turned to the surveyor, pointed to the open front door, and instructed him to leave my property immediately. The surveyor scrambled to collect his equipment, his hands shaking as he hastily packed the expensive lenses into his canvas bag. He was clearly accustomed to dealing with vacant lots and abandoned buildings, not a homeowner who commanded the room with absolute authority. In his rush to escape the suffocating tension of the living room, he swung his heavy bag over his shoulder too quickly. The canvas strap caught the edge of the mahogany side table. The sudden impact knocked a thick, tightly rolled cylinder of heavy drafting paper out of the side pocket. The cylinder hit the polished hardwood floor and unfurled across the room, stopping directly at the toe of my leather shoe. Emily let out a sharp gasp. She lunged forward, her high heels slipping on the rug as she desperately attempted to snatch the paper away from me. I stepped firmly onto the bottom corner of the heavy parchment, pinning it to the floor. I knelt down and picked it up. I ignored Emily's frantic protests and the surveyor's terrified silence. I carried the document to the dining table, spread it flat, and anchored the corners with my grocery bags. It was a comprehensive architectural blueprint. I leaned over the table, my eyes scanning the intricate grid lines and structural elevations. The drawing did not depict a modernized version of my historic home. It depicted the complete erasure of my entire lot. The topographical map showed my house, the garden Cynthia had cultivated for 30 years, and the ancient oak trees in the backyard completely leveled and replaced by a monolithic concrete foundation. Overlaying my property was a highly detailed schematic for a massive, multi-level luxury condominium complex. The title block in the bottom right corner listed the proposed development as Apex Urban Residences. I traced the property lines with my index finger, absorbing the sheer scale of the betrayal laid out in black and white ink. Jordan and Emily did not simply want to force me into an assisted living facility to sell my house to a nice family. They had contracted a commercial surveying firm to prepare my land for total demolition. They were actively finalizing a deal to sell my legacy to a corporate developer intending to bulldoze my history into dust to cover the massive debts generated by their own pathetic vanity. The magnitude of their greed was staggering. I rolled the blueprint back into a tight cylinder and tucked it under my arm. I turned to face Emily. She stood paralyzed by the front door, her face drained of all color, entirely aware that the illusion of her innocent decorator was irreparably shattered. I did not demand an explanation. I pointed to the driveway and told her to get out. The heavy oak door closed behind them, leaving me alone with the blueprint. I walked into my study, locked the door, and picked up the phone to call Jonathan. The game had shifted from a defensive maneuver to a hostile corporate takeover. I locked the heavy oak door of my study and sat at my mahogany desk. The rolled architectural blueprint rested against the brass lamp, a physical testament to my son's profound treachery. Less than an hour later, a sharp, rhythmic knock echoed through the quiet house. I opened the front door to find Daniel standing on the porch. My private investigator did not wear a stereotypical trench coat or fedora. He wore a crisp navy suit and carried himself with the invisible efficiency of a man who spent his life dissecting the financial secrets of the elite. Daniel stepped inside, bypassed the pleasantries, and handed me a thick, leather-bound dossier. He stated that the perimeter was secure and that the commercial land surveyor was currently sitting in downtown traffic, likely drafting a frantic apology email to his corporate superiors for losing the blueprints. I offered Daniel a seat in the study, but he declined, preferring to stand near the window to monitor the street. I unclasped the dossier and spread the intelligence report across my desk. The documents were meticulously organized, detailing every digital communication, wire transfer, and legal maneuver Jordan had initiated over the past 3 weeks. The blueprint had only shown the physical destruction of my historic home. Daniel's report revealed the complete financial anatomy of my son's master plan. I read the pages with a cold, detached precision. The raw shock of the initial betrayal had burned away entirely, leaving behind a crystalline, unyielding focus. Jordan was not acting out of momentary panic. He had engineered a comprehensive, multi-layered strategy to erase my existence and convert my legacy into liquid capital. The intelligence report outlined a transaction so ruthlessly efficient it bordered on sociopathic. Jordan had brokered a preliminary under-the-table agreement to sell my double-lot property to a massive commercial developer named Apex Equities. The proposed purchase price was $7 million. The math laid out before me was a grotesque testament to his unearned entitlement. Jordan planned to use the initial $2 million bridge loan to immediately pacify the dangerous underground syndicate currently holding his illegal sports betting markers. He would then use the remaining $5 million from the final sale to completely eradicate the mortgage on his suburban mansion, clear Emily's astronomical credit card balances from her European shopping sprees, and inject a massive influx of phantom equity into his failing tech startup. He intended to walk away from the total destruction of my life as a resurrected debt-free millionaire. The report also contained the final destination for my remains while I was still drawing breath. Jordan had not merely browsed assisted living facilities. He had finalized the intake paperwork for a state-funded institution located 80 miles outside the city limits. The facility was notorious for its horrific staff-to-patient ratios, numerous state health violations, and severe medical neglect. It was a sterile warehouse for the forgotten, a place where inconvenient elders were chemically restrained and left to wither in isolation. By exiling me to a county institution far from my community, Jordan ensured I would have no access to private legal counsel, no means of communication, and no ability to contest his absolute legally mandated power of attorney. He was actively condemning me to a slow, agonizing death in a fluorescent-lit room solely to fund Emily's vanity and his own catastrophic gambling habits. I turned the page, shifting my focus from my son's moral bankruptcy to the corporate entity facilitating his scheme. I needed to deeply understand the mechanics of the enemy buying my destruction. I reviewed the corporate profile of Apex Equities. They were an aggressive, highly capitalized urban development firm, specializing in the acquisition and demolition of historic residential zones to construct luxury commercial spaces. They operated with ruthless efficiency, utilizing proxy buyers and shell companies to swallow entire neighborhoods before the longtime residents even realized they were under a corporate siege. I stared at the embossed logo of Apex Equities printed at the top of the preliminary purchase agreement. I traced the sharp, angular lines of the corporate crest with my index finger. A slow, chilling realization washed over me, transforming the agonizing sting of family betrayal into an overwhelming sense of absolute, undeniable power. I picked up the secure landline on my desk and dialed Jonathan's direct number. He answered immediately, the background noise of his corporate law firm completely muted. I informed him that Daniel had delivered the intelligence report and that the trespassing surveyor had successfully, albeit inadvertently, supplied the structural demolition blueprints. I told Jonathan that Jordan was attempting to finalize the irreversible sale of my property by Friday morning. Jonathan asked for the exact name of the purchasing development firm so he could prepare the appropriate cease and desist injunctions to halt the land transfer. I read the name Apex Equities aloud. A heavy, pregnant silence fell over the phone line. I heard the sharp intake of Jonathan's breath as the sheer cosmic irony of the situation crystallized in his brilliant legal mind. I did not ask him to draft a standard legal warning or file a simple restraining order. I instructed Jonathan to schedule an emergency, mandatory board meeting for the executive directors of Apex Equities the following morning. Jordan believed he had found the perfect faceless corporate leviathan to execute his grand betrayal. He believed he was outsmarting an ignorant, obsolete old man by selling my legacy to an untouchable billionaire conglomerate. He was entirely unaware of the actual origin of that specific conglomerate. Decades ago, when I began transitioning my massive commercial shipping profits into urban real estate, I established multiple acquisition firms to completely insulate my identity and my wealth from the predatory public market. Apex Equities was the glittering crown jewel of that strategic expansion. I owned the primary holding company that owned the secondary shell corporation that fully funded Apex Equities. I held the silent, unassailable majority stake in the entire operation. My son was not selling my historic home to a group of ruthless, wealthy strangers. He was desperately attempting to sell my own land directly back to me. I instructed Jonathan to finalize the agenda for the emergency board meeting, ensuring my physical presence would be unannounced, and I hung up the phone. The trap was meticulously set, perfectly primed to snap shut on the very hands that built it. The morning sunlight filtered through the historic glass panes of my study, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the quiet air. I had not slept. I spent the early hours coordinating with Daniel. His elite security technicians had arrived before dawn, moving through my home with silent efficiency. They installed microscopic, high-definition audio-visual recording devices into the crown molding of the living room, the foyer, and the study. By noon, my house was a fortress of digital surveillance. The trap was armed. At precisely 2 o'clock, the heavy brass knocker echoed through the hallway. Jordan had arrived. He did not come with an apology for his wife's blatant trespassing. He came with reinforcements. I opened the door to find him standing on the porch next to a woman clutching a thick leather binder. Jordan wore an expression of manufactured sorrow, a pathetic imitation of filial concern. He told me that Emily was deeply traumatized by my unprovoked aggression yesterday. He claimed my hostility toward a simple interior decorator was the final terrifying symptom of my deteriorating mind. He stepped aside, presenting the woman. She introduced herself as a specialized grief counselor and behavioral interventionist. Her smile was predatory sharp and entirely devoid of warmth. I noted the absence of a clinical badge. I recognized the tactic immediately. Jordan, terrified by the loss of the spare key and the potential discovery of the blueprint, was accelerating his timeline. He needed to secure my psychiatric commitment before Friday. He needed raw material for his forged medical evaluation. I stepped back and opened the door wide, inviting the ambush into my home. I directed them toward the living room, guiding them precisely to the vintage velvet sofa positioned in the direct focal center of 3 hidden cameras. I offered them coffee. The counselor declined abruptly, stating they were not there for a social visit. I excused myself, walked to the kitchen, and poured a single cup of black coffee for myself. I moved with slow, deliberate precision. I would not let them dictate the tempo of my own house. When I returned and took my seat in the leather armchair across from them, the psychological assault commenced. The counselor did not ask how I was feeling or how I was managing my days. She launched into a relentless, aggressive interrogation designed to disorient and overwhelm. She demanded to know the current day of the week, the exact date of my late wife's passing, and the name of the current president. Before I could finish a sentence, she interrupted, shifting topics rapidly to manufacture confusion. She weaponized my grief, suggesting that my refusal to sell the house was a dangerous pathological obsession with a dead woman. I glanced at the mahogany coffee table. Jordan had placed his smartphone face down on the polished wood. A tiny green indicator light pulsed near the microphone. They were recording. They wanted me to yell. They needed me to throw them out, to slam my fist on the table, to validate the narrative of an erratic, violent old man losing his grip on reality. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I looked the counselor directly in her eyes and answered every rapid-fire question with chilling chronological perfection. I did not raise my voice a fraction of a decibel. When she pressed me on the hostile encounter with Emily's decorator, I calmly corrected her terminology. I cited the exact state statute regarding criminal trespass. I explained that I had merely removed an unlicensed commercial land surveyor from my private property. The counselor's predatory smile faltered. The rhythm of her interrogation broke against the fortress of my absolute stoicism. Seeing her struggle, I smoothly took control of the conversation. I asked for her state medical licensing number. I inquired about the specific psychiatric institution she was affiliated with and requested a physical copy of her clinical credentials. She gripped her leather binder tightly, her confident demeanor shattering into defensive, disorganized stammering. She muttered something about operating as an independent, holistic consultant. Jordan shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, realizing his hired mercenary was being dismantled by the very man she was brought in to break. Jordan snatched his smartphone from the coffee table, his face flushed with a mixture of humiliation and raw panic. He stood up abruptly, dragging the flustered consultant with him. He declared loudly that my combative nature and refusal to accept help were exactly why he had to intervene. He was speaking directly into the microphone of his phone, desperately trying to salvage a usable soundbite for his fraudulent medical file. I remained seated in my armchair. I offered them a polite, unbothered farewell as they hastily retreated toward the foyer. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, echoing through the empty house. I set my coffee cup down and retrieved my encrypted tablet from the study. I accessed the security network Daniel had installed. I watched the high-definition playback of the entire interaction. The audio was pristine. I had a permanent, undeniable record of my son attempting to manufacture a psychiatric crisis using an unlicensed fraud. I saved the file to my secure cloud server. The silence of the house settled around me once more. 10 minutes later, the quiet was pierced by a sharp electronic chime from my cellular phone. It was an automated notification from a regional commercial bank. This was the modest institution holding the basic checking account Cynthia and I had opened 40 years ago. It held a meager balance used solely for local grocery purchases and utility bills. More importantly, it was the only financial account Jordan actually knew existed. I opened the secure message. The bold red text informed me that my primary checking account had been completely frozen. A secondary alert detailed the exact reason for the total restriction of funds. A concerned family member had filed an emergency expedited report of severe elder fraud. The report claimed I was suffering from extreme dementia and actively wiring my pension to international scammers. Jordan, entirely cornered by the failure of his psychiatric ambush, had opted for the nuclear option. He believed that by severing my access to my meager public funds, he would starve me out. He assumed that a frozen checking account would leave me unable to buy food, pay for electricity, or hire legal counsel. He thought he was cutting off my lifeblood, forcing me to crawl to him for financial mercy. He was completely unaware that he had just handed me the final, irrefutable legal justification required to utterly destroy him. He thought he was locking a frail old man in a cage. He did not know I owned the keys to the entire financial system. The morning after this bank alert triggered on my phone, I left my house with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had absolutely nowhere important to be. I drove my 10-year-old sedan through the morning traffic, projecting the image of a retired dispatcher heading to the local hardware store. In reality, I navigated to the polished marble lobby of the downtown high-rise that housed Jonathan's corporate law firm. I bypassed the main reception desk, entirely ignoring the bustling crowd of junior associates and paralegals. I stepped into a private frosted glass elevator keyed exclusively for senior partners and top-tier clients. The doors opened directly into a secure, soundproofed conference room overlooking the financial district. The city stretched out below us, a grid of concrete and steel where fortunes were quietly made and dismantled. Jonathan was already waiting at the head of the long glass table, flanked by stacks of encrypted financial ledgers. I sat opposite him and placed my tablet face down on the table. I informed him about the automated notification I had received the previous evening. I explained that Jordan had successfully weaponized my meager public checking account, utilizing a fabricated report of elder fraud to freeze the only funds he believed I possessed. Jonathan immediately reached for his phone, offering to file an emergency injunction to lift the restriction and severely penalize the regional bank for acting on an unsubstantiated report without conducting a formal investigation. I raised my hand, stopping him before he could dial. I instructed him to do absolutely nothing about the frozen funds. Jordan had engineered this specific crisis to force me into a corner of perceived helplessness. He wanted to starve me out to break my spirit by removing my ability to purchase groceries or keep the lights on. If I suddenly unfroze the account with high-powered aggressive legal intervention, it would immediately signal that I possessed resources and representation far beyond a standard pensioner. Jordan needed to remain completely intoxicated by his false sense of victory. I would let him bask in the illusion that his cruel strategy had worked. I would allow him to believe I was currently sitting in a dark house gripped by financial terror waiting for an inevitable eviction. We would leave the checking account frozen as a brilliant decoy. It was a tactical concession designed to keep his focus entirely misdirected while we systematically dismantled the very foundation of his existence. Jonathan nodded, recognizing the architecture of my strategy instantly. He set his phone down and slid a fresh, thick stack of documents across the glass table. These were the detailed ledgers of Jordan's outstanding liabilities compiled by Jonathan's private financial team overnight. The $500,000 deficit was not a simple, unfortunate business failure. Jordan owed exactly $500,000 to a syndicate of shadow lenders and unregulated debt aggregators. These were aggressive, borderline illegal entities that operated through a labyrinth of shell companies specializing in high-interest bridge loans and underground sports betting markers. They survived on intimidation, exorbitant late fees, and the total ruthless liquidation of their debtors' physical assets. I ran my finger over the names of the holding companies currently holding my son's financial leash. They were predators circling a bleeding target. I looked at Jonathan and delivered my primary directive. I instructed him to purchase the entirety of Jordan's debt. Jonathan's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before his professional mask snapped back into place. He outlined the immense, staggering complexity of acquiring distressed debt from unregulated entities. It would require deploying our own aggressive holding companies to negotiate the transfer without triggering any alarms in the financial sector or revealing the true identity of the buyer. The shadow lenders would require massive cash incentives to release their grip on the debt contracts. I told him I did not care about the complexity or the premium cost. I authorized him to leverage whatever capital was necessary from our offshore reserves to execute the acquisition immediately. I wanted the debt purchased outright consolidated into a single impenetrable portfolio and legally transferred under our absolute control. Jordan was desperately trying to sell my historic home to a commercial developer to satisfy these faceless predators. He was attempting to destroy my sanctuary to save himself from men he genuinely feared. He did not understand the elemental rules of power. Leverage is not a static object. Leverage is a fluid dynamic, and it inevitably moves toward the individual possessing the greatest capital. By purchasing his debt, I was not bailing him out of his mistakes. I was not forgiving his transgressions. I was stepping directly into the role of his executioner. I would become the predator he was running from. Jonathan pulled his laptop forward and began typing with rapid, precise keystrokes, initiating a cascade of aggressive corporate maneuvers. He utilized a secondary acquisition firm we had established years ago, specifically for hostile takeovers and quiet market interventions. The process was ruthless and entirely invisible to the public market. We systematically bought out the various bookmakers and shadow lenders holding Jordan's markers, offering them immediate, undeniable liquidity in exchange for total assignment of the debt contracts. We moved with overwhelming financial force, leaving the original lenders no logical choice but to accept our buyout and step away from my son. By early afternoon, the digital ink on the final transfer agreements had dried. The sterile air of the conference room felt charged with a new, heavy reality. Jonathan turned his high-resolution monitor toward me, displaying the consolidated ledger. The complex multi-tiered transaction was a complete success. The scattered $500,000 debt had been entirely swallowed, restructured, and legally assigned to a single corporate entity. Jordan no longer owed money to a dozen dangerous bookmakers and aggressive shadow banks. He owed a single massive sum to Vanguard Holdings. Jonathan printed the formal notice of debt reassignment. It was a cold, legally binding document informing the debtor that his financial obligations had been successfully acquired by a new primary creditor, detailing the new payment structures and the uncompromising penalties for default. I held the crisp parchment in my hands, tracing the heavily embossed seal of Vanguard Holdings at the top of the page. Jordan would receive this notice by certified signature-required courier by the end of the day. He would undoubtedly feel a massive surge of temporary relief, assuming that a legitimate corporate holding company had bought out the aggressive street-level lenders. He would mistakenly believe that he could now negotiate standard repayment terms, stall for time with corporate lawyers, or hide behind traditional bankruptcy protections. He would assume he had escaped the immediate threat of physical retaliation and merely traded it for bureaucratic red tape. He would think the worst of his nightmare was finally over. What my son did not know, what he could not possibly fathom in his wildest, most paranoid calculations, was the true architectural structure of Vanguard Holdings. It was a private equity shield I had established more than 20 years ago to aggressively manage my high-yield commercial real estate acquisitions and logistics contracts. There were no public shareholders, no board of directors to answer to, and no external investors. Vanguard Holdings was a corporate ghost ship operating entirely under the absolute command of a single invisible proprietor. I handed the notice back to Jonathan, instructing him to initiate immediate, uncompromising collection protocols the second the document was delivered. The absolute trap had been flawlessly set. Jordan was desperately attempting to sell my land to my own development firm, orchestrating a forged psychiatric commitment, all to pay off a massive, crushing debt that he now legally owed directly to his father. The rented penthouse smelled of imported white orchids and raw, suffocating panic. Emily and Jordan had secured the top floor of the Sapphire Tower in the financial district, an architectural glass cage overlooking the city they so desperately wished to conquer. They called the evening a charity gala for urban renewal, a thinly veiled, glittering masquerade designed exclusively to siphon emergency capital from gullible socialites. Crystal flutes clinked endlessly, filled with vintage champagne purchased on maxed-out credit lines that Jonathan was currently monitoring from his downtown office. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated with silver trays of beluga caviar and truffle canapes, while a hired orchestral quartet played softly in the corner. It was a masterpiece of financial illusion, an intricate stage play funded by money they no longer possessed. Jordan stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, sweating visibly through the collar of his silk shirt as he pitched his phantom condominium project to a circle of wealthy gray-haired men. Emily glided through the crowd in a backless designer gown, flashing her brilliant, entirely hollow smile, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire existence was currently owned by Vanguard Holdings. They needed a massive, immediate injection of cash. The syndicate debt had vanished from their radar, replaced by the crushing weight of Vanguard, but their daily operational deficit was a gaping infected wound. They were peddling the demolition of my home as a guaranteed return on investment, aggressively selling shares to a property they did not own to a developer they did not realize I controlled. I observed this entire spectacle from the shadowed vestibule. I did not wear the faded wool cardigans or the practical orthotics they were accustomed to seeing. I wore a bespoke midnight blue suit crafted from heavy English wool, a garment tailored to the exact, uncompromising specifications of my actual life. I adjusted my silk tie, stepped onto the polished marble floor, and walked directly into their collapsing house of cards. The ambient chatter of the room dipped perceptibly the moment I crossed the threshold. Wealth recognizes power even when it is unannounced and completely unexpected. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Jordan was gesturing wildly with a champagne flute when his eyes locked onto mine across the expanse of the room. The color drained from his face with such violent speed he appeared physically ill. His hand trembled, spilling a drop of golden liquid onto his pristine cuff. He was paralyzed, entirely unable to comprehend how the frail old man he had attempted to freeze out of a local checking account was standing in the center of an exclusive penthouse gala, looking like a veteran corporate titan. Emily, however, reacted with the pure instinctual aggression of a cornered animal. She spotted me, her eyes widening in sheer terror before snapping into a hyper-vigilant glare. She abandoned a conversation with a local socialite, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble as she intercepted me halfway across the room. She did not lower her voice or attempt to handle the situation with discretion. She escalated her volume, ensuring everyone within a 20-foot radius could hear her clearly. She grabbed my forearm, her manicured nails digging into the expensive wool of my jacket, and projected a tone of exaggerated, pitying sweetness. She announced to the surrounding guests that her poor, declining father-in-law had somehow wandered out of his house again. She loudly lamented my worsening confusion, stating that I frequently suffered from severe cognitive lapses and delusional episodes that required constant monitoring. She instructed a nearby waiter to fetch a glass of tap water for my supposed medication, painting a vivid, tragic picture of an old man entirely detached from reality. She was actively attempting to publicly validate the forged medical documents she had left on my dining table. She wanted to neutralize my presence by rendering me an object of pity rather than a threat. I did not pull my arm away. I did not raise my voice to defend my sanity. To argue with a hysteric is to validate their premise. I simply looked down at her hand, gripping my sleeve. I looked at it with such profound clinical disgust that her fingers involuntarily released the fabric. I met the gaze of the wealthy onlookers she had tried to orchestrate against me. I offered them a polite, razor-sharp nod, my posture radiating absolute, unyielding clarity. I thanked Emily for her misplaced concern, stating clearly and calmly that my memory was completely intact, particularly regarding the exact cascading balance of her European credit cards. Emily choked on her next breath. She stepped back, her masquerade shattering under the weight of my precision. I stepped past her, moving purposefully toward the corner of the room where Jordan was guarding his primary target. The mark was a man named Richard Sterling, a heavy-set, notoriously ruthless venture capitalist known for bankrolling aggressively ambitious urban developments. Jordan was practically vibrating with anxiety as he unrolled a glossy promotional brochure for Apex urban residences across a high-top cocktail table. He was selling my land. He was selling the soil Cynthia and I had cultivated for decades. I approached the table with a slow, measured cadence. Jordan froze his jaw, working silently, completely incapable of forming a coherent sentence as I took a position directly across from Sterling. I extended my hand, introducing myself simply as Gregory, a longtime resident and independent structural consultant for the historic district. Sterling shook my hand enthusiastically, clearly unimpressed by Jordan's desperate, sweaty sales pitch and eager for a rational perspective. I glanced down at the glossy rendering of the luxury condominiums. I praised the architectural ambition of the design, noting the sheer audacity of planning a subterranean parking garage on that specific municipal grid. Sterling leaned in, his interest piqued by the sudden shift to technical logistics. I calmly informed him that the proposed development lot sat directly above a protected Class 3 municipal aqueduct. I detailed the specific zoning ordinances enacted in 1982 that permanently restricted any deep foundation excavation in that quadrant. I did not raise my voice. I recited soil grading metrics, water table elevations, and structural preservation codes with the lethal, effortless recall of a man who owned the entire district. I pointed out that overcoming these environmental restrictions would require a minimum of a decade of legal battles with the City Planning Commission, generating millions in unforeseen legal fees before a single piece of heavy machinery ever struck the earth. I looked at Jordan, whose face was now a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. He knew I was telling the absolute truth, and he knew he could not contradict me without exposing his own fraudulent timeline. I concluded my assessment by casually questioning the fiscal sanity of any firm attempting to bypass such insurmountable municipal hurdles, wondering aloud if the developer had deliberately obscured these facts to secure blind funding from unsuspecting partners. Sterling's expression hardened instantly. The genial warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by the cold calculus of a man who realized he was being played for a fool. He looked from the brochure to Jordan, the realization of a catastrophic investment dawning with brutal clarity. He did not ask for further clarification. He did not offer Jordan a single chance to speak or defend the project. Sterling picked up his empty champagne flute, placed it squarely on top of the fraudulent brochure, and stated that his firm had zero tolerance for mismanaged municipal liabilities. He turned his back on my son and walked out of the penthouse. The primary funding for their survival evaporated in less than 3 minutes, dismantled not by anger, not by vengeance, but by undeniable, inescapable facts. The immediate aftermath of Richard Sterling's departure from the penthouse stripped Jordan of his last remaining illusion. The phantom millions he had banked his entire existence on evaporated into the sterile air of the financial district, leaving only the crushing reality of Vanguard Holdings and the violent syndicate breathing down his neck. He did not stay to watch Emily attempt to pacify the confused, whispering gala guests. He bolted for the private freight elevator, his mind fracturing under the weight of imminent financial execution. By the time his tires violently struck the pavement outside the Sapphire Tower, his panic had transmuted into a feral, unhinged rage. He blamed the strict municipal zoning boards. He blamed Sterling for possessing a shred of basic due diligence. Above all, he blamed the stubborn old man who refused to die quietly and surrender his assets. Jordan gripped the steering wheel of his leased luxury sedan, his knuckles turning white as he sped through the desolate city streets. The digital clock on the dashboard glowed bright red, displaying 2 a.m. His meticulously crafted timeline to secure the commercial bridge loan was completely obliterated. He needed raw, undeniable leverage immediately. He needed the physical original deed to my historic property. With that heavy parchment document in his possession, he believed he could completely bypass the rigorous municipal checks, forge a direct rapid transfer of ownership, and offer the land as collateral to a new, less scrupulous shadow lender before Vanguard initiated foreclosure proceedings. He drove with reckless abandon, running traffic lights consumed by a singular destructive objective. He pulled onto my quiet, tree-lined street, cutting the headlights a full block away. He parked the sedan flush against the curb, letting the engine die. The historic home stood silent and imposing under the pale moonlight. There were no lights on inside. Jordan stepped out into the freezing night air, pulling the collar of his cashmere coat up against his neck. He bypassed the front door entirely, moving with the hurried, clumsy steps of a desperate man. He crept along the manicured hedges Cynthia had planted decades ago, heading directly for the narrow side alley that bordered my study. He had officially crossed the threshold from white-collar corporate fraud into outright physical criminality. Jordan pressed his face against the cold glass of the study window. The interior was a cavern of impenetrable darkness. He did not hesitate. He picked up a heavy decorative garden stone resting near the azalea bushes. He swung his arm backward and drove the rock brutally into the center of the vintage glass pane. The sharp, violent crash of shattering glass ruptured the absolute stillness of the neighborhood. Jagged shards rained down onto the polished oak floorboards inside. Jordan reached his arm through the dangerous opening, uncaring as the broken edges sliced through the expensive fabric of his suit sleeve. He fumbled blindly for the brass latch, disengaged the lock, and heaved the heavy wooden frame upward. He tumbled over the sill, landing heavily on the Persian rug. He did not freeze to check for a wailing security siren. He pulled a small tactical flashlight from his pocket, the harsh white beam cutting wildly across the room. He moved directly toward my antique mahogany roll-top desk. He firmly believed the physical deed was secured in the bottom right drawer, locked away like a relic of a bygone era. He gripped the ornate brass handle and pulled with all his body weight. It was locked. He let out a guttural sound of pure frustration and kicked the heavy wood panels. He grabbed a heavy bronze paperweight shaped like a ship's anchor from the top of the desk and began smashing it repeatedly against the locking mechanism. Wood splintered and cracked under the relentless primitive assault. With a final violent strike, the antique lock gave way. Jordan ripped the drawer open so forcefully it derailed from its wooden tracks, crashing loudly onto the floor. He dropped to his knees, frantically tearing through decades of meticulously organized files. He tossed tax returns, municipal utility bills, and insurance premiums over his shoulder. Paper drifted through the air like toxic snow. He found nothing of value. His breathing became ragged and shallow, echoing loudly in the quiet house. He scrambled to his feet and turned his frantic attention to the towering oak bookshelves lining the far wall. He wildly theorized I had hidden the deed inside a hollowed book or slipped it between the encyclopedias. He began sweeping his arm aggressively across the shelves, violently knocking hundreds of heavy leather-bound volumes to the floor. The antique spines cracked. The delicate pages tore. He was not merely searching for a legal document. He was punishing the room. He was punishing the legacy that refused to submit to his greed. He ripped open the tall filing cabinets, dumping hanging folders onto the growing pile of debris. He overturned the wastebasket. He swept the brass reading lamp and the matching vintage pen set off the desk, shattering them against the floorboards. The study, a place of quiet reflection and strategic planning, was reduced to a chaotic war zone. Jordan stood in the center of the devastation, his chest heaving, his flashlight darting frantically across the ruined room. He spun in tight circles, trapped in a cage of his own making, entirely consumed by the agonizing realization that the deed was simply not there. I did not wake up to the sound of breaking glass. I was already awake. I was sitting in the high-backed leather armchair positioned in the deepest pitch-black corner of the study. I had been sitting there in total silence for 2 hours, waiting with the absolute patience of a predator. The exact moment Sterling walked out of the penthouse, I knew exactly how my son's fragile, entitled psychology would react. I knew the sudden loss of the phantom capital would drive him to physical desperation. I did not shift my weight when the heavy stone shattered the window. I did not blink when the blinding flashlight beam swept mere inches past my face. I remained perfectly still, my breathing slow and deeply measured, practically invisible in the heavy shadows of the room. I watched the boy I had raised tear my history apart. I watched him smash the desk Cynthia had bought me for our 10th wedding anniversary. I watched him destroy the very books I had read to him when he was a child. There was no hot anger left in my chest. There was only a profound clinical observation of a man entirely devoid of moral structure. He was actively committing a severe felony inches away from me. He was violating every established boundary of law and familial respect. He did not know that high-definition infrared security cameras were mounted seamlessly in the crown molding directly above his head. Daniel's sophisticated surveillance network was currently capturing every desperate movement, every shattered item, and every clear angle of his face in stark, undeniable night vision. The time-stamped footage was simultaneously streaming to a highly secure off-site server managed exclusively by Jonathan's legal team. Jordan was actively recording his own physical ruin to perfectly match his financial destruction. He let out a sharp, breathless curse, dropping the flashlight onto the ruined desk. He ran his shaking hands over his face, entirely defeated. He turned toward the window, preparing to climb back out into the freezing night, completely empty-handed and thoroughly out of options. I did not speak. I did not reveal my presence or demand an explanation. I allowed him to pull himself awkwardly over the sill and vanish back into the darkness. He needed to believe he had escaped undetected. He needed to carry the agonizing heavy weight of his complete failure back to his suburban mansion. The trap required him to feel entirely secure in his physical freedom, while the legal guillotine positioned itself precisely above his neck. The heavy silence returned to the study, broken only by the cold winter wind blowing through the shattered window. I remained seated in the heavy leather armchair long after the crunch of Jordan's tires faded into the silent winter night. The freezing wind whipped through the shattered window panes, scattering the torn pages of my library across the ruined oak floorboards. I did not reach for the telephone to summon the local authorities. A conventional police response would only result in a standard burglary report, a minor property damage charge that Jordan's corporate lawyers could easily negotiate down to a misdemeanor. Calling the local precinct now would alert my son that he had been caught, providing him the opportunity to pivot his strategy, hire defense attorneys, and hide his tracks. I needed him to remain arrogant, blind, and completely committed to his own destruction. I stood up, adjusting the lapels of my suit in the freezing room, and walked out, locking the heavy study door behind me. I sent a brief, encrypted message to Daniel instructing his elite forensic team to arrive silently through the rear service entrance. They spent the next 3 hours meticulously photographing the shattered glass, swabbing the blood Jordan had left on the windowsill, and indexing the exact position of every destroyed piece of furniture. By dawn, the room was a perfectly documented crime scene. The morning sun eventually rose, casting a harsh, unyielding light over the manicured lawns of my neighborhood. At exactly 9 o'clock, the sharp chime of the front doorbell broke the morning quiet. I opened the door to find a young, nervous man in a cheap suit standing on the porch. He did not offer a polite greeting. He quickly shoved a thick, legally sealed envelope into my hands, asked me to confirm my identity, and sprinted back to his idling car. He was a process server delivering the next phase of my son's desperate offensive. I closed the door, carried the heavy envelope to the kitchen island, and broke the seal with a silver letter opener. I spread the dense legal documents across the polished granite counter. It was a formal, expedited petition for emergency guardianship filed in the county family court just hours after Jordan had fled my property. I read through the allegations with a detached clinical fascination. My son had not merely filed a standard request for medical oversight. He had constructed a brazen, highly detailed work of absolute fiction. Attached to the primary petition was a sworn, notarized affidavit bearing Jordan's signature. In the statement, he claimed to have visited my home late last night out of deep, agonizing concern for my deteriorating mental state. He wrote that upon his arrival, he discovered me in the midst of a violent, terrifying, delusional episode. According to his sworn testimony, I had completely lost touch with reality, frantically tearing my own study apart, smashing my vintage desk, and destroying my books in a paranoid frenzy. The affidavit escalated into outright perjury when Jordan detailed a fabricated physical assault. He claimed that when he attempted to calm me down and offer genuine familial support, I turned my aggressive rage toward him, brandishing a heavy bronze paperweight and forcing him to flee the house in genuine fear for his personal safety. He was explicitly weaponizing the destruction he had caused, attributing the shattered window and the ruined mahogany furniture to my supposed descent into severe, violent dementia. He had orchestrated the break-in not just to steal the physical deed to the property, but to manufacture visceral physical evidence of an unhinged mind. The petition included preliminary evaluations from 3 different private physicians who had never once met me yet were willing to sign their names endorsing Jordan's desperate narrative. They cited my combative behavior with Emily's interior decorator, the recently frozen status of my public checking account, and this newly invented violent outburst as irrefutable proof that I posed an immediate danger to myself and others. The legal trap was remarkably aggressive. By filing an emergency petition claiming immediate physical danger and severe cognitive decline, Jordan bypassed the standard lengthy judicial review process. He was demanding that a judge instantly strip me of all my civil liberties, freeze all my remaining assets, and grant him absolute unchecked control over my life, my health, and my property. He wanted the power to lock me away in the horrific state-funded facility he had already selected before the week was over, silencing me forever while he liquidated my legacy to pay off Vanguard holdings. I stared at the stamped court seal at the bottom of the page, marveling at the sheer unadulterated sociopathy required to execute such a maneuver against one's own flesh and blood. I placed the entire stack of fraudulent legal documents into a secure briefcase and drove directly back to the downtown financial district. Jonathan was waiting in his private office finalizing the Vanguard Holdings debt acquisition. I dropped the guardianship petition onto his glass desk without saying a word. Jonathan adjusted his glasses, reading through Jordan's fabricated affidavit with intense, rapid focus. When he reached the section detailing my supposed violent rampage and the destruction of the study, a slow, genuine smile spread across his usually stoic face. He looked up at me, tapping his pen against the polished glass. He noted the profound, almost comedic irony of Jordan formally swearing under penalty of perjury that he was an innocent victim of an unprovoked attack while we possessed multiple angles of high-definition infrared video proving he was the sole perpetrator of a violent felony. The judicial hearing for the emergency guardianship was mandated to take place in exactly 48 hours. Jonathan suggested we simply walk into the courtroom, play the security footage for the presiding judge, and watch Jordan be immediately arrested by court bailiffs for perjury, breaking and entering, and felony elder abuse. I shook my head, rejecting the simple approach. Exposing the lie was not enough. I required a defense so overwhelmingly absolute that it would permanently humiliate Jordan and anyone foolish enough to support him. I instructed Jonathan to utilize his most elite medical contacts. I wanted an immediate comprehensive evaluation scheduled with Dr. Eris Thorne, the absolute leading forensic psychiatrist in the state. Dr. Thorne was notoriously unbribable, a ruthless clinical diagnostician frequently utilized by the federal courts for high-profile competency hearings. I would voluntarily submit to the most rigorous, exhausting psychological and cognitive testing available. I would undergo hours of grueling mental exams, brain scans, and behavioral assessments to eliminate even the shadow of a doubt. I would not simply prove that my son was a criminal liar. I would enter that courtroom armed with an unimpeachable, ironclad medical certification of my superior cognitive functions signed by the most respected medical authority in the entire region. The stage for the final, devastating confrontation was meticulously set. Jordan believed he was marching into a rubber-stamp court hearing to easily conquer a frail, defenseless old man whose mind was crumbling. He had absolutely no idea he was walking directly into an inescapable legal slaughterhouse, completely blind to the reality that his father held the financial leash to his entire existence. The fluorescent lights of the county family court cast a pale, unforgiving glare across the polished linoleum floor. I sat on a hard wooden bench near the double doors of courtroom 4B, observing my son from a distance. Jordan and Emily occupied a seating area at the far end of the corridor. They had dressed specifically for the performance. Jordan wore a subdued charcoal suit, his posture intentionally slumped to project the heavy burden of a grieving, desperate son. Emily had chosen a modest, high-necked dress in dark navy, clutching a crumpled tissue in her hands as she performed quiet theatrical sobs for the benefit of passing court clerks and security personnel. They were flanked by a man I immediately recognized from Jonathan's preliminary intelligence briefings. Marcus Vance was a notorious aggressive litigator who specialized in rapid asset liquidation and predatory guardianship acquisitions. Vance possessed the slick, overly polished demeanor of a man who traded exclusively in human misery. He leaned in close to Jordan, whispering final instructions while patting Emily's shoulder in a display of manufactured sympathy. They believed they were waiting for a mere formality, a quick judicial rubber stamp that would officially transfer my entire existence into their eager hands. Jonathan sat beside me, his briefcase resting comfortably on his lap. He did not review any last-minute notes. He did not pace the hallway. He simply watched Vance with the quiet, predatory calm of a veteran chess player, observing an opponent walk willingly into a discovered checkmate. The heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom swung open. A bailiff called our case number. Jordan stood up, adjusting his expression into a mask of profound, tragic concern. He offered his arm to Emily, guiding her into the sterile arena where he intended to execute my civil death. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit, and walked in right behind them. Judge Eleanor Sterling presided over the emergency hearing. She was a veteran magistrate with a reputation for zero tolerance regarding courtroom theatrics and unsubstantiated claims. Marcus Vance immediately took the floor, wasting no time in deploying his aggressive, sensationalized narrative. He paced in front of the judge's bench, painting a tragic, horrifying picture of a beloved patriarch rapidly succumbing to severe, violent dementia. Vance submitted the heavily padded folder of fraudulent documents into evidence. He highlighted the preliminary evaluations from the 3 private physicians, deliberately emphasizing their alarming fabricated conclusions regarding my cognitive decay and physical unpredictability. Vance then pivoted seamlessly to the financial argument. He informed the judge that my primary checking account had recently been frozen due to suspicious irrational activity, purposefully failing to mention that Jordan was the individual who had anonymously initiated that exact freeze. Vance framed this restriction as undeniable proof that I was actively bleeding my resources and required immediate, uncompromising financial stewardship. The climax of his presentation, however, centered entirely on the sworn notarized affidavit Jordan had signed just 48 hours ago. Vance read the perjury aloud, his voice dripping with dramatic gravity. He detailed the fictitious event of Jordan arriving at my historic home to offer comfort, only to be met with a terrifying, unprovoked physical assault. He described the devastated state of my study in vivid detail, claiming I had destroyed my own antique furniture and valuable library in a fit of paranoid, uncontrolled rage. Vance argued that my son had barely escaped the house with his physical safety intact, emphasizing the profound emotional trauma the fictional event had inflicted upon the family. He concluded his blistering argument by formally requesting the immediate total suspension of my civil rights. Vance demanded that Jordan be granted absolute emergency conservatorship over my medical decisions, my physical residency, and the entirety of my financial estate. He insisted that placing me in a secure, locked psychiatric facility was not merely a medical necessity, but a strict moral imperative to protect me from myself and to safeguard the public from my violent outbursts. Jordan sat at the plaintiff's table with his head bowed, wiping away a non-existent tear, playing the role of the shattered son forced to make a heartbreaking decision. Judge Sterling turned her sharp, assessing gaze toward our defense table, clearly expecting the standard, desperate medical counter-arguments. She asked Jonathan if we had secured our own psychiatric evaluations to contest the emergency petition. Jonathan stood up calmly, buttoning his suit jacket. He addressed the court with absolute, chilling precision. He stated that while we did possess a comprehensive, impenetrable medical clearance from Dr. Eris Thorne, the state's undisputed leading forensic psychiatrist, he would not be submitting it to the court for review just yet. Jonathan informed the judge that medical arguments were entirely irrelevant because the foundation of the plaintiff's petition was built on absolute demonstrable perjury. He withdrew a secure digital drive from his briefcase and requested permission to submit physical security evidence directly to the court. Judge Sterling granted the request, her professional interest visibly piqued by the sudden shift in defense strategy. Jonathan stepped forward and connected the drive to the courtroom's central monitor system. The large digital screen mounted above the judge's bench flickered to life. It did not show a confused, violent old man suffering from dementia. The monitor displayed crystal-clear, high-definition infrared night vision footage of my study. The bright digital timestamp in the corner verified the exact date and minute Jordan claimed the assault occurred. The entire courtroom watched in dead, stunned silence as the heavy garden stone shattered my window. They watched Jordan climb awkwardly over the broken glass, his face illuminated perfectly by the harsh, erratic beam of his own tactical flashlight. They watched my son systematically, violently destroy my historic study. They saw him smash the antique desk with a bronze paperweight, tear open the drawers, and sweep hundreds of books onto the floor in a desperate criminal frenzy. The footage clearly showed me sitting completely still in the dark corner of the room, calmly observing his felony from the shadows. Jonathan paused the video precisely on a clear, undeniable close-up of Jordan's enraged, panic-stricken face. Jonathan turned slowly to Marcus Vance, whose aggressive courtroom demeanor had entirely evaporated, leaving him staring at the screen in professional horror. Jonathan then addressed the judge, stating that Jordan's sworn affidavit was a complete fabrication designed exclusively to facilitate elder fraud. My son had not been the victim of a delusional attack. He had committed felony breaking and entering, severe destruction of property, and blatant perjury in a desperate documented attempt to steal the physical deed to my home. The trap had finally slammed shut. The absolute silence in the courtroom shattered into a cacophony of frantic, disorganized panic. Marcus Vance scrambled to his feet, his heavy leather chair screeching violently against the polished linoleum floor. The slick, predatory confidence he had weaponized just minutes earlier dissolved instantly into professional desperation. He slammed his hand onto the plaintiff's table, shouting a rapid-fire barrage of panicked legal objections. He demanded the immediate suppression of the video, citing severe violations of state privacy statutes, unauthorized electronic surveillance, and the fundamental inadmissibility of unverified digital media. He pointed a trembling accusatory finger at the massive monitor, arguing loudly that a father recording the interior of his own private residence without prior notification was somehow an illegal, malicious entrapment of his unsuspecting son. Judge Eleanor Sterling did not entertain a single second of the hysteria. She struck her wooden gavel with a sharp, resonant crack that instantly severed Vance's desperate tirade. She leaned forward over the elevated mahogany bench and informed the counselor in a tone that radiated absolute judicial freezing point that a homeowner possessed the unequivocal constitutional legal right to install security cameras within the private confines of their own property to capture the commission of a violent felony. She ordered Vance to sit down immediately and remain entirely silent or face a direct citation for contempt. Jordan remained frozen in his chair. His eyes were wide, glassy, and completely vacant. He was physically unable to tear his gaze away from the suspended, high-definition image of his own terrified, guilty face projected massively above the judge's head. Beside him, Emily visibly recoiled. Her manufactured theatrical sobs ceased entirely. They were instantly replaced by short, hyperventilating gasps as she physically shrank away from her husband, pressing herself into the wooden barrier of the gallery. The flawless, tragic narrative they had meticulously constructed to steal my legacy was currently burning to ash under the unforgiving fluorescent lights of the courtroom. Jonathan did not allow the opposition a single fraction of a second to recover their equilibrium. He moved with the ruthless mechanical efficiency of an apex predator closing its jaws around a struggling target. He stepped smoothly away from our table, approached the court clerk's desk, and submitted a heavy, securely bound dossier wrapped in thick parchment. He announced the immediate entry of my comprehensive medical and psychiatric evaluation into the official court record. He noted clearly that the examination had been conducted less than 24 hours prior by Dr. Eris Thorne, the state's absolute preeminent forensic diagnostic specialist. Jonathan detailed the clinical findings with devastating surgical precision. The evaluation categorically certified my cognitive function as exceptional, noting 0 indications of dementia, 0 signs of paranoia, and absolutely no neurological deterioration. Dr. Thorne had explicitly highlighted my extraordinary situational awareness, my flawless memory retention, and my profound analytical clarity. The entire foundation of Jordan's emergency petition, the desperate manufactured claim that I required immediate institutionalization for my own physical safety, was obliterated instantly by the highest, most unassailable medical authority in the jurisdiction. But Jonathan was not finished. A defense merely protects the perimeter. We were currently operating inside the courtroom to destroy the enemy entirely. He retrieved a secondary thinner folder from his encrypted briefcase. He approached the judge's bench once more, requesting formal permission to introduce supplemental financial documentation to conclusively establish the plaintiff's malicious underlying intent. Judge Sterling nodded sharply, her eyes fixed completely on the rapid, unfolding demolition of the plaintiff's fraudulent case. Jonathan submitted a thick stack of expedited commercial bridge loan applications. These were the exact desperate filings Jordan had initiated with Vanguard Holdings to secure liquid capital before I silently purchased his massive debt. Jonathan projected the final signature pages onto the central courtroom monitor, displaying them directly beside the paused infrared security footage of the midnight break-in. The entire courtroom stared at the glowing digital display. At the bottom of each heavily leveraged high-interest loan agreement, occupying the blank space strictly designated for the primary financial guarantor, was my signature. It was an intricate, highly practiced, flawless forgery. Jonathan explained the timeline to the judge with devastating clarity. Jordan had systematically falsified my signature to fraudulently leverage my historic property as direct collateral for his massive underwater corporate debts. He had executed these brazen forgeries mere days before filing the expedited guardianship petition. When the Shadow Syndicate lenders demanded physical verification of the original property deed to finalize the transaction, Jordan had panicked. That raw financial panic culminated in the violent midnight breach of my study captured explicitly on the security cameras. He had not broken into my home out of deep familial concern or a desire to check on my well-being. He had broken in to steal the physical deed necessary to complete a $500,000 financial fraud. The silence in the room deepened significantly, transforming rapidly from initial shock into a heavy, suffocating awareness of absolute, undeniable criminality. Jordan physically collapsed forward, resting his forehead heavily against the hardwood table, utterly destroyed by the revelation of his own mechanics. Judge Sterling did not request a brief recess to deliberate the overwhelming facts. She did not ask Marcus Vance if he possessed a desperate final rebuttal. She looked down at the mountain of irrefutable, damning evidence resting on her desk, and then turned her gaze upon my son with a look of profound, visceral, judicial disgust. She struck her gavel a second time with a decisive, echoing finality that signaled the absolute end of the legal charade. She declared the emergency petition for guardianship completely dismissed with extreme prejudice. She permanently barred Jordan from ever filing a similar fraudulent motion in her jurisdiction, stating for the official court record that the plaintiff's entire case was a malicious predatory fabrication designed explicitly to facilitate elder exploitation and severe financial theft. The absolute magnitude of her ruling escalated, instantly shifting from a civil dismissal to a catastrophic legal reckoning. Judge Sterling announced in a booming voice that the court would not simply dismiss the civil matter and allow the perpetrators to walk away. She formally ordered the court clerk to immediately impound the high-definition security footage, the forged commercial loan applications, and Jordan's sworn perjured affidavit. She instructed the armed bailiff to physically transport the entire cache of sealed evidence directly across the street to the district attorney's Major Crimes Division. She was initiating a formal, expedited criminal referral directly from the bench. She looked down at Jordan and informed him coldly that he was now the primary target of an active, highly prioritized felony investigation for aggressive perjury, breaking and entering grand financial fraud, and felony elder abuse. Marcus Vance abruptly packed his expensive leather briefcase, snapping the brass clasps shut with a sharp, echoing click. He did not offer his ruined clients a polite farewell or a desperate strategy for the impending, unavoidable criminal fallout. He abandoned them immediately at the table, fleeing the courtroom with rapid steps to salvage his own professional reputation from the highly radioactive blast radius of their massive lies. Jordan slowly lifted his head from the polished wooden table. His face was entirely hollow, completely drained of the arrogant, unearned entitlement that had defined his entire adult existence. Emily stood trembling beside him, her hands shaking violently as she stared blankly at the heavy courtroom doors as if they led directly into a concrete prison cell. They were not leaving the municipal building as wealthy, triumphant urban developers or empowered, victorious conservators. They walked out of the family court and into the sterile, fluorescent hallway as completely ruined individuals facing the absolute, undeniable certainty of imminent, devastating criminal arrest. I remained seated calmly at the defense table, watching them exit my life. I felt no lingering pity for the boy I had raised. I felt no sorrow or regret. I felt the pure, unadulterated, crystalline peace of a man who had successfully and permanently excised a malignant infection from his legacy. The drive from the municipal courthouse back to their sprawling suburban estate was a journey I did not need to physically witness to perfectly comprehend. Daniel's elite surveillance operatives, positioned discreetly at the perimeter of their gated community to monitor their movements prior to the impending arrest warrants, reported the final violent fracture of their union with pristine clarity. Jordan and Emily conducted the drive in a suffocating, leaden silence. Jordan gripped the steering wheel of his least luxury sedan so tightly, his knuckles drained of blood, his eyes fixed blindly on the gray asphalt ahead. Emily sat rigidly in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her mind racing through a frantic, ruthless calculus of self-preservation. They had walked into the family court as arrogant predators anticipating an easy, legally sanctioned slaughter. They had fled the building as exposed, documented felons. The heavy iron gates of their driveway swung open, granting them entry into a manufactured paradise they could no longer afford to maintain. The sprawling six-bedroom mansion, purchased entirely with phantom equity and sustained by aggressive predatory credit lines, loomed before them like a beautifully decorated mausoleum. They stepped through the grand double doors into the vaulted foyer. The air inside felt instantly cold and hollow. The illusion of their sophisticated, untouchable wealth had been incinerated by Judge Sterling's gavel. Vanguard Holdings, the faceless corporate leviathan now entirely controlled by my own hand, owned every single cent of their crushing debt. The district attorney was currently processing a mountain of irrefutable digital and financial evidence to secure their indictments. Marcus Vance, their aggressively confident legal mercenary, had formally abandoned them the exact moment the perjury was exposed in the courtroom. They were completely and utterly isolated. The sprawling house offered no comfort, only the echoing reminder of their catastrophic, irreversible failure. Jordan collapsed onto the pristine white sofa in the formal living room, loosening his silk tie with trembling fingers. The alliance that had bound them together, a marriage constructed entirely on mutual greed, and the shared anticipation of my unearned inheritance, was actively fracturing under the immense crushing gravity of imminent criminal prosecution. Jordan buried his face in his hands, drawing ragged, shallow breaths as the adrenaline of the courtroom confrontation drained away, leaving only a visceral, raw terror. He looked up at Emily, his eyes wide and severely bloodshot. He stated clearly that the district attorney would not hesitate to move forward. Arrest warrants for severe elder fraud, felony, breaking and entering, and commercial forgery were actively being drafted by municipal prosecutors. He told her they needed to retain a premier criminal defense attorney immediately, a top-tier legal shark capable of navigating federal financial crimes and aggressive perjury charges. He wildly estimated the required retainer fee to be well over $200,000 just to keep him out of a holding cell. He then articulated the crushing immediate reality of their financial situation. They possessed absolute zero liquid capital. Vanguard Holdings had aggressively swallowed their shadow debts and was actively suffocating their remaining credit profiles. Their checking accounts were vaporized. The only tangible, unencumbered assets they possessed were parked in the climate-controlled garage. Jordan stood up and begged his wife to immediately liquidate her imported sports car and the luxury utility vehicle. He pleaded with her to contact a specialized high-end auto broker that very night, explaining frantically that the cash from those vehicles was the only thing standing between him and a decade in a state penitentiary. Emily did not flinch. She did not offer a comforting embrace or a strategic reassurance. She looked at her husband with an expression of profound, unadulterated contempt. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest and flatly refused. She stated with absolute glacial clarity that those vehicles were registered exclusively in her name, and she would not sacrifice her personal property to salvage his catastrophic incompetence. Jordan stared at her, entirely bewildered by the sudden absolute withdrawal of her partnership. He reminded her loudly that she was fully complicit, that she had loudly fabricated my dementia at the penthouse gala, and that she had actively aided in orchestrating the fraudulent guardianship petition. Emily laughed, a harsh, brittle sound completely devoid of warmth or humor. She systematically dismantled his desperate plea. She pointed a manicured finger directly at his chest, declaring that the forged commercial loan documents bore his signature, not hers. She reminded him that the high-definition night vision footage submitted to the court showed him alone destroying his father's study. She aggressively rewrote the narrative of their conspiracy on the spot. She claimed she was merely a devoted, frightened wife acting on the false medical information her husband had provided. She intended to explicitly play the role of the manipulated spouse who had been entirely deceived by Jordan's sociopathic greed. She blamed him entirely for the failed scheme, citing his sloppy forgery, his impulsive midnight break-in, and his staggering underestimation of my intellectual capacity. The marital alliance was officially dead, severed cleanly by the sharp blade of criminal liability. Emily turned her back on her devastated husband and marched up the grand sweeping staircase toward the master suite. Jordan remained frozen in the living room, the total reality of his isolation finally sinking into his fractured, panicking mind. 10 minutes later, Emily reappeared at the top of the landing. She was dragging 2 massive hard-shell designer suitcases behind her. She descended the stairs with a brisk, purposeful rhythm, entirely ignoring the man trembling at the bottom of the steps. She stopped in the foyer and unzipped her expensive leather handbag. She pulled out a thick, professionally bound legal document and threw it forcefully onto the glass console table. The heavy packet slid across the smooth surface, stopping inches from Jordan's hand. He stared down at the bold, undeniable header printed on the first page. They were formally drafted expedited divorce papers. Emily had not conjured this legal strategy in the desperate, silent car ride home. She had quietly consulted a ruthless, high-priced divorce attorney the exact morning the initial bridge loan application had collapsed. She had anticipated his failure early on and proactively prepared her own customized escape route. She looked at Jordan with eyes as cold and unforgiving as winter ice. She declared that her attorney would be filing the papers at the county courthouse at the exact moment the clerk's office opened at dawn. She loudly proclaimed her legal intention to seize exactly half of their remaining marital assets, demanding her full share of the phantom equity she incredibly still believed existed in the mansion. She intended to liquidate everything she could physically carry and sever her legal attachment to his sinking ship before the district attorney's investigators inevitably knocked on the front door with heavy iron rams. She grabbed the handles of her heavy luggage and dragged them toward the grand entryway, the wheels clattering loudly against the marble tile. She honestly believed she could simply walk away from the massive, sprawling wreckage they had jointly created. She believed she could outrun the blast radius of the financial and criminal explosion simply by changing her last name, abandoning the property, and boarding a first-class flight out of the jurisdiction. Emily opened the heavy oak door, stepped out into the freezing night, and slammed the door shut behind her. She left Jordan entirely alone in the massive, echoing house to face the absolute, undeniable certainty of his imminent arrest and total destruction. Emily sat in the pristine, glass-walled conference room of her divorce attorney's downtown office, sipping sparkling water with the serene confidence of a woman who had just successfully amputated a gangrenous limb. The morning sun poured over the polished mahogany table, illuminating the meticulously drafted dissolution documents she had hurled at Jordan the previous night. Her attorney, a notoriously ruthless litigator named Valerie Sterling, sat across from her, reviewing the asset inventory with clinical detachment. Emily felt absolutely untouchable. She had spent the entire cab ride from the suburban estate to the city planning her immediate future. She visualized a clean break, a quiet relocation to an expensive coastal city, and a fresh start funded by the aggressive liquidation of her 50% share of their marital assets. She firmly believed the sprawling 6-bedroom mansion held massive equity. She believed her luxury vehicles, her designer jewelry, and her private savings accounts were completely insulated from Jordan's catastrophic legal and financial implosion. In her mind, the criminal perjury and the botched break-in at Gregory's historic home were entirely Jordan's failures. She had simply played the role of the concerned wife at the penthouse gala. She had never swung the stone that shattered the study window. She had never physically forged the commercial loan documents. Therefore, she reasoned the impending district attorney investigation would target her husband exclusively. Emily smoothed the fabric of her tailored skirt, admiring the panoramic view of the financial district stretching out below them. She had survived the sinking ship by commandeering the only lifeboat. Valerie turned a page of the portfolio, nodding approvingly at the aggressive asset division strategy. Emily took another sip of water, her mind already boarding a first-class flight far away from the wreckage of her marriage. The heavy glass door of the conference room swung open abruptly, breaking the quiet atmosphere of elite legal strategy. A junior paralegal stepped into the room looking pale and visibly uncomfortable. He did not offer a polite apology for the sudden interruption. He walked directly to Valerie and handed her a thick, red-tabbed envelope marked for immediate priority review. The paralegal whispered quietly that the package had just been delivered via bonded courier directly from the executive legal division of Vanguard Holdings. Emily felt a sudden sharp spike of adrenaline pierce her calm exterior at the mention of the corporate Leviathan. She knew Vanguard was the shadow syndicate holding Jordan's massive commercial bridge loan. She assumed this was merely a courtesy copy of Jordan's foreclosure notice, a final confirmation that her husband's corporate dreams had been formally executed and extinguished. Valerie broke the seal and extracted a dense stack of heavily notarized financial documents. She adjusted her reading glasses, scanning the first page with rapid, professional efficiency. Emily watched her attorney's expression shift drastically. The shark-like confidence vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid tension that pulled at the corners of Valerie's mouth. Valerie flipped to the second page, then the third, her eyes darting across the paragraphs of dense legal formatting. Jonathan had perfectly timed this secondary strike. He had explicitly waited for Emily to officially file the divorce petition, allowing her to formally declare her financial independence on the public record, before deploying Vanguard Holdings as a precision weapon. The document in Valerie's hands was not a standard notification of marital debt aimed at her husband. It was a formal aggressive notice of accelerated debt collection, naming Emily as the primary target and demanding immediate payment in full. Valerie looked up from the paperwork, her gaze fixing on Emily with a chilling clinical severity. She placed the documents flat on the mahogany table and slid them slowly across the polished wood. She instructed Emily to look closely at the signature lines on the third page of the commercial credit acquisition file. Emily leaned forward, her heart hammering violently against her ribs as she stared at the highlighted sections. She expected to see Jordan's desperate, sloppy forgery of Gregory's signature. Instead, she saw her own flawless, looping handwriting stamped in dark blue ink at the bottom of a comprehensive corporate guarantor agreement. The trap Gregory had built was not designed exclusively for his son. It was a wide-net financial snare engineered to capture every single parasite attached to his legacy. Jonathan had thoroughly audited Vanguard's newly acquired portfolio and unearthed the foundational paperwork of Jordan's initial corporate startup. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the suffocating reality of her situation began to materialize. Valerie folded her hands over the table, delivering the lethal legal reality with absolute unforgiving bluntness. The $500,000 commercial debt owed to Vanguard Holdings was not solely Jordan's burden. During the early optimistic days of their corporate ambitions, long before Jordan resorted to breaking into his father's study to steal the physical deed, they had required initial seed capital to lease office space and project an image of wealth. To secure that first massive line of credit, Emily had willingly and legally signed the primary collateral agreements alongside her husband. She had eagerly pledged her own financial standing to launch his firm, entirely motivated by the desire to reap the eventual profits. Valerie explained that because the debt was acquired during the legal bounds of their marriage, and because it explicitly bore Emily's verified signature as a co-guarantor, she was completely jointly liable for the entire $500,000. The massive corporate debt was irrevocably attached to her Social Security number. She could not divorce her way out of a secured commercial lien. Valerie explicitly outlined the catastrophic consequences of this revelation. Vanguard Holdings possessed the immediate, unchecked legal authority to seize Emily's personal bank accounts. They possessed the right to instantly repossess her imported luxury vehicles directly from the law office parking garage. They could legally garnish any future wages she earned and freeze all her credit lines until the massive deficit was satisfied in full. The phantom equity in the suburban mansion was already completely vaporized by the primary mortgage default. Emily had absolutely nothing left to liquidate. Her aggressive divorce petition, rather than serving as a brilliant escape hatch, merely isolated her as a prime defenseless target for Vanguard's predatory collection attorneys. She could not board a flight and abandon the wreckage. She was permanently chained to the exact same sinking ship she had just mocked her husband for drowning on. Gregory had not merely defeated their fraudulent guardianship scheme. He had ensured that both the architect and the accomplice were financially annihilated, bound together by the very greed that had initially united them. Emily stared at her own signature on the corporate document. The sleek glass walls of the high-rise law office suddenly felt exactly like the walls of a maximum security prison cell. The brilliant, untouchable future she had visualized just 10 minutes prior dissolved into ash, leaving her entirely trapped in a cage of her own making, facing total ruin without a single ally remaining. Emily refused to let the suffocating reality of Valerie Sterling's law office dictate her behavior the following afternoon. She operated under the desperate, arrogant delusion that perception was reality. If she projected absolute, unbothered wealth, the looming shadow of Vanguard Holdings would somehow simply evaporate. She dressed in a flawless, tailored ivory suit and drove her imported luxury sedan to the exclusive Oak Room at the Sapphire Country Club. This was her sanctuary, a pristine environment of vaulted ceilings, glittering crystal chandeliers, and aggressively manicured social hierarchies. She had invited her 3 most influential wealthy friends for a lavish celebratory lunch. She intended to control the narrative of her sudden divorce before the vicious suburban rumor mill could twist the facts against her. Emily sat at the premier table by the floor-to-ceiling windows, ordering vintage champagne, imported caviar, and the most expensive entrees on the menu. She held court with practiced elegance, laughing brightly and dismissing Jordan as a tedious, unambitious burden she was finally shedding. She painted her impending divorce not as a frantic escape from a $500,000 commercial fraud, but as a liberating journey towards self-actualization. Her friends listened with rapt attention, sipping their champagne and offering sympathetic, rehearsed nods. Emily felt a fleeting, intoxicating surge of absolute power. She commanded the room. She was surrounded by the elite echelons of the city, perfectly insulated by the heavy linen tablecloths and the deferential staff. She believed that as long as she sat at this table flanked by old money and corporate wives, the grim, brutal mechanics of debt collection and legal liens could not possibly touch her. The luncheon stretched for 2 hours of effortless indulgence. When the heavy leather check folio finally arrived resting on a polished silver tray, Emily reached for it with a performative display of casual generosity. She waved off her friends' polite, half-hearted attempts to split the massive bill. She unzipped her designer handbag, retrieved a heavy black platinum credit card, and dropped it onto the tray with a satisfying metallic clink. It was the ultimate gesture of her supposedly untouchable status. The waitress, a young woman with a perfectly neutral expression, took the tray and vanished toward the mahogany service station. Emily resumed her animated story about relocating to the coast, completely ignoring the slight anxious tremor in her own hands. 10 minutes passed. The waitress returned to the table, but she did not carry the standard receipt book and a sleek black pen. She carried the platinum card pinched between her fingers, her posture rigid with professional discomfort. She leaned down, bringing her face close to Emily's ear, and whispered in a hushed, apologetic tone that the transaction had not gone through. The card had been aggressively declined. Emily felt a cold spike of genuine panic pierce her chest, but she instantly masked it with a brilliant, dismissive smile. She laughed lightly, waving her hand in the air, loudly blaming her bank's overly sensitive fraud prevention algorithms. She claimed the sudden massive legal retainers she had paid her divorce attorney earlier that morning must have triggered an automatic security freeze on her primary account. Her friends offered polite, understanding chuckles, though their eyes sharpened with a sudden predatory curiosity. Emily reached back into her handbag, retrieving a secondary premium-tier credit card tied to a completely different national bank. She handed it to the waitress with a sharp, commanding nod, instructing her to run it quickly. The waitress departed, but the effortless atmosphere at the table had irrevocably shifted. The conversation became strained, punctuated by awkward pauses. 5 agonizing minutes later, the waitress returned. This time she was accompanied by the general manager of the country club. The manager approached the table with a grim, tight-lipped expression. He did not lean in to whisper. He stood at the edge of the table and stated clearly in a voice loud enough to carry to the adjacent booths that the secondary card had also been severely declined. He informed Emily that the authorization terminal was not returning a standard fraud alert or a simple insufficient funds error. The terminal was displaying a hard mandatory asset freeze code. The manager placed the 2 rejected credit cards back onto the white linen tablecloth, crossing his hands behind his back. The absolute silence that descended upon Emily's table quickly radiated outward, infecting the surrounding diners. Dozens of wealthy, influential eyes turned directly toward the commotion. The flawless, impenetrable facade Emily had spent years meticulously building was cracking violently under the unforgiving scrutiny of her entire social circle. Emily stared at the useless plastic rectangles resting on the table, her mind stalling entirely. The manager leaned forward, lowering his voice to deliver the final devastating blow. He informed her that he had personally called the merchant authorization line to resolve the issue for a valued member. The bank representative had explicitly confirmed that every single account associated with her Social Security number had been immediately locked. Vanguard Holdings had not waited for a lengthy judicial review. Armed with the irrefutable co-signed commercial loan documents Jonathan had expertly verified, their aggressive collection division had filed a comprehensive corporate lien across her entire financial portfolio. Every checking account, every savings reserve, every premium credit line, and every emergency fund she possessed was instantly and legally paralyzed pending the recovery of the $500,000 debt. Gregory had orchestrated a flawless, synchronized financial execution. He had allowed her to formally file for divorce, effectively severing her emotional ties to Jordan, only to ensure she remained permanently chained to the exact same crushing financial anchor. She was utterly trapped. Emily could not speak. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. She looked up at her 3 elite friends. The sympathetic, rehearsed smiles had completely vanished. They stared at her with expressions of profound, unmasked revulsion and deep social embarrassment. Beatrice, the wealthiest woman at the table, quietly opened her own purse, withdrew a card, and handed it to the manager to settle the massive bill. She did not make eye contact with Emily. She simply stood up, gathered her cashmere coat, and walked away without uttering a single word of farewell. The other two women immediately followed suit, fleeing the table as if Emily were suddenly infectious. Emily was left sitting completely alone in the center of the crowded, whispering dining room. The manager politely but firmly requested that she exit the premises and resolve her severe financial discrepancies before attempting to return to the club. She gathered her handbag with shaking, numb fingers. She stood up on unsteady legs and walked toward the grand double doors. She did not hold her head high. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the carpet, feeling the burning, judgmental stares of the city's elite tracking her every step. The public humiliation was absolute and irreversible. She walked out of the exclusive sanctuary not as a triumphant, liberated woman, but as an exposed, financially annihilated fraud carrying the full, crushing weight of a $500,000 debt she could never escape. Jordan remained perfectly still in the cavernous foyer of his 6-bedroom suburban estate, long after the taillights of Emily's departing cab vanished into the freezing winter night. The absolute silence of the empty mansion pressed against his eardrums, heavy and suffocating. Without Emily's frantic, calculating energy filling the space, the house revealed its true nature. It was no longer a symbol of his elite status or a testament to his corporate acumen. It was a hollow, over-leveraged monument to his profound arrogance and monumental failure. He walked slowly into the formal dining room, his expensive leather shoes echoing sharply against the imported Italian marble floors. He sank into a velvet chair at the head of a massive mahogany table he could no longer afford to maintain. At precisely 6 o'clock the following evening, the ambient hum of the central heating system died. The recessed lighting lining the vaulted ceiling flickered once, buzzed weakly, and extinguished entirely. The municipal utility companies, automatically notified of the severe cascading credit freezes initiated by Vanguard Holdings, had moved with ruthless administrative efficiency. Jordan sat in the encroaching darkness, the bitter winter cold seeping rapidly through the expensive, uninsulated floor-to-ceiling windows. He pulled his cashmere coat tightly around his shoulders, his breath forming pale, fleeting clouds in the freezing air. He possessed absolutely no cash to restore the power grid, no functioning credit lines to secure a cheap hotel room, and entirely no allies left to call for salvation. His professional network had severed all ties the exact moment the perjury scandal leaked from the family court proceedings. His prospective defense attorneys demanded $250,000 in liquid capital he simply did not possess just to review the impending criminal indictments. He was trapped. He was a prisoner in a freezing, pitch-black cage built entirely of his own fraudulent ambition, waiting for the final blow to fall. The sudden, violent pounding at the heavy oak front door ruptured the dead silence of the estate. Jordan flinched involuntarily, his heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. He remained frozen in the chair, convinced it was the local police department arriving to execute the felony arrest warrants Judge Sterling had explicitly promised from the bench. He stood up on shaking, unsteady legs, navigating blindly through the pitch-black hallway, using the faint, dying glow of his cellular phone screen. He unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the door open, bracing his body for the harsh glare of tactical flashlights and the cold snap of steel handcuffs closing around his wrists. Instead, a lone, shivering courier stood on the frost-covered porch. The man did not offer a polite greeting or ask for a formal signature. He thrust a thick, heavily taped legal parcel directly into Jordan's chest, turned on his heel, and sprinted back to his idling vehicle without uttering a single word. Jordan closed the door and leaned heavily against the freezing wood. He tore open the thick cardboard packaging with numb, clumsy fingers, stripping away the tape in long, jagged strips. He extracted a dense stack of legal documents printed on heavy premium paper. He carried the pages back to the dining room, placing them flat on the table, and illuminated the text with the harsh, narrow beam of his phone's flashlight. The bold, undeniable header printed across the first page dictated a formal, immediate notice of default and foreclosure. The document outlined his catastrophic financial failure with surgical, terrifying precision. It detailed the exact sum of the $500,000 commercial bridge loan, highlighting the fraudulent collateral agreements he had desperately forged. It announced the immediate, non-negotiable acceleration of the entire debt portfolio. The notice explicitly stated that due to severe breach of contract, documented criminal fraud, and the recent judicial findings of perjury, the standard grace period for repayment was entirely revoked. The lender was initiating the immediate absolute seizure of the suburban estate. The document commanded Jordan to vacate the premises within 72 hours before armed municipal sheriffs arrived to physically enforce the eviction and change the locks. The mansion, the ultimate physical manifestation of his corporate ego and his primary weapon for social leverage, was being legally ripped from his hands. He was being cast out into the freezing winter streets with absolutely nothing to his name, stripped of his assets, his marriage, and his freedom. Jordan stared at the eviction mandate, his mind fracturing completely under the weight of his total inescapable ruin. Jordan turned the heavy pages of the foreclosure notice, his bloodshot eyes scanning the dense bureaucratic terminology, desperately searching for a legal loophole, a clerical error, or a fleeting chance at negotiation. He stopped abruptly at the bottom of the third page, his gaze locking onto the corporate insignia. The documentation was not drafted by the predatory offshore shadow syndicate he had originally approached for the illicit bridge loan. The letterhead was stamped with the sleek, embossed silver logo of Vanguard Holdings. He remembered the name vividly from Emily's frantic, screaming departure the night before. Vanguard was the massive, faceless corporate entity that had aggressively acquired his underwater debt and subsequently frozen their entire financial existence. Jordan's eyes darted down to the final page of the notice, frantically searching for the contact information of the corporate litigation team to beg for a temporary stay of execution. He bypassed the standard corporate legal jargon and found the official certification stamp of the holding company. Beneath the signature line, printed clearly in dark permanent ink, was the required state disclosure of the primary executive board and the majority shareholder directing the acquisition. Jordan read the name printed on the document. The freezing air in his lungs completely solidified. The name listed as the absolute controlling authority and sole proprietor of Vanguard Holdings was Gregory Sterling, his father, the frail elderly man he had dismissed as a senile, useless burden, the man he had violently attempted to rob in the dead of night, the man he had tried to systematically institutionalize and strip of all civil liberties. Gregory had not simply defeated his fraudulent courtroom petition with superior legal tactics. Gregory had quietly, methodically purchased Jordan's entire financial existence from the shadows. He owned the $500,000 debt. He owned the forged collateral agreements. He owned the mansion. Jordan dropped the paperwork onto the marble table, stepping backward into the freezing darkness as the horrific, undeniable truth finally crushed him. He had not been outsmarted by a rival firm or a predatory banking institution. He had been completely, utterly annihilated by the father he had arrogantly tried to destroy. Jordan remained paralyzed in the dark dining room of his sprawling suburban estate, the revelation of his father's ownership of Vanguard Holdings echoing endlessly in his hollowed mind. The ambient temperature in the mansion continued to plummet, matching the absolute zero of his financial reality. The sound of a heavy key turning in the front deadbolt broke his catatonic state. Emily walked back into the freezing, unlit foyer. She did not drag her designer luggage with the arrogant, triumphant momentum she had possessed the night before. Her posture was entirely defeated, her expensive ivory suit crumpled and her face pale with shock. The unyielding machinery of Gregory's financial snare had caught her just as swiftly and brutally. She dropped her bags onto the marble floor and found Jordan sitting in the shadows. She confessed, her voice stripped of all its former elitist venom, that every single personal account tied to her Social Security number was completely locked. The country club humiliation had cemented her total social ruin, broadcasting her financial execution to her entire peer group. The expedited divorce petition she had so proudly flaunted offered absolutely no protection against the joint commercial liability she had willingly co-signed. They sat together in the freezing darkness of the mansion they were scheduled to lose in less than 72 hours, stripped of their arrogance, their phantom wealth, and their social standing. The bitter, toxic animosity that had fractured their marriage just 24 hours earlier dissolved instantly into a shared, suffocating terror. They were two cornered animals forced back into a desperate, pathetic alliance purely out of base survival instinct. They had exhausted every legal maneuver, alienated every corporate connection, and burned every line of credit. The only entity on Earth possessing the power to halt the impending criminal indictments, lift the crushing asset freezes, and stop the foreclosure was the very man they had aggressively conspired to lock away in a psychiatric ward. Jordan and Emily climbed into the least luxury sedan, their movements sluggish, heavy, and robotic. The drive from the affluent gated suburbs back to my historic tree-lined street was conducted in total oppressive silence. There was no calculating strategy discussed, no aggressive plotting, and no debate over asset allocation. They were operating on pure, unadulterated desperation. They pulled up to the curb, parking flush against the sidewalk in the exact spot where Jordan had parked mere days ago to commit a violent felony. The imposing historic home stood silent and resolute under the pale winter moonlight. Soft, warm light spilled from the windows of my newly repaired study, casting long, elegant shadows across the manicured lawns Cynthia had planted decades ago. They stepped out of the vehicle into the biting, unforgiving winter air, pulling their thin luxury coats tightly around their shivering frames. They bypassed the manicured hedges entirely and walked directly up the central stone pathway. There was no stealth in their approach, no entitlement in their posture, and absolutely no pretense of corporate superiority. They climbed the wooden steps to the front porch as completely broken individuals. Jordan raised his fist and began to strike the heavy oak door. He did not knock with the authoritative, demanding cadence he had always employed when summoning my attention. He pounded on the thick wood with the frantic, uncoordinated rhythm of a drowning man hammering against a rescue boat. He called out my name, his voice cracking hoarse and entirely stripped of its usual slick corporate confidence. He begged loudly for a conversation. He pleaded for a single fleeting opportunity to explain his actions, to apologize for the extreme disrespect, to somehow miraculously negotiate terms for the profound destruction he had orchestrated. Emily joined him, her voice rising in a shrill, desperate wail that echoed down the quiet street. She pressed her face against the cold glass panels framing the entryway, crying openly and shamelessly. She promised repeatedly that they would return the money, cancel the divorce proceedings, drop every single legal petition, and walk away from Vanguard Holdings entirely. They offered hollow, desperate bargains promising absolute lifelong submission in exchange for basic mercy. They stood on my porch shivering violently in the freezing cold, their tears freezing on their cheeks. They loudly begged the father they had treated as a disposable, senile obstacle to rescue them from the catastrophic, inescapable consequences of their own unmitigated greed. They shouted their pathetic apologies into the quiet neighborhood, shattering the evening stillness with their groveling desperation. The heavy oak door remained firmly and resolutely shut. The solid brass locks did not turn. The warm, inviting light from the interior continued to spill out onto the porch, illuminating their misery. But the physical barrier between my peaceful sanctuary and their absolute ruin did not yield a single inch. Instead, the sharp, rhythmic sound of heavy boots crunching against the frost-covered gravel echoed from the side alley bordering the property. A towering, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark, unmarked tactical uniform stepped out from the deep shadows of the azalea bushes. He was a private security operative deployed directly by Daniel's elite protection firm, stationed permanently on the grounds to ensure my absolute physical safety and enforce my boundaries. The guard approached the porch with a disciplined, intimidating calm. He did not place his hand on his holstered weapon, nor did he raise his voice to match their hysterical volume. He simply walked up the steps and inserted his large frame directly between Jordan and the front door, physically blocking their desperate assault on the wood. He reached into his heavy tactical vest and produced a thick, legally sealed document. He handed the packet directly to Jordan, stating in a flat, uncompromising, authoritative tone that they were officially trespassing on private property. The document was a formalized, court-ordered injunction. It was a comprehensive emergency restraining order signed by a municipal judge, strictly barring both Jordan and Emily from coming within 500 feet of my person, my historic home, or any of my corporate holdings under penalty of immediate incarceration. The guard instructed them to vacate the premises within 30 seconds or face instant physical arrest for violating the judicial mandate. Jordan stared down at the restraining order, his hands trembling so violently the heavy parchment pages rustled loudly in the quiet air. Emily backed away, her desperate sobs catching in her throat as the cold, hard finality of their exclusion fully registered. I stood perfectly still in the center of the illuminated study, watching the entire pathetic spectacle unfold through the flawlessly restored glass window. I observed the son I had raised and the daughter-in-law who had relentlessly mocked me stand shivering on my lawn, clutching a piece of paper that legally permanently banished them from my existence. I felt no sudden surge of triumphant victory, no hot flash of vindictive pleasure, and absolutely no lingering sorrow for their self-inflicted collapse. I watched them with the detached clinical observation of a man viewing complete strangers through a museum display case. I turned my back on the window, walked slowly toward my newly polished mahogany desk, and left them entirely to the freezing darkness. The morning sun offered absolutely no warmth as it struck the towering glass facade of Jonathan's downtown law firm. Gregory Sterling stepped out of the private executive elevator onto the top floor, his posture immaculate, his tailored charcoal suit a stark contrast to the casual, unassuming cardigans his son had recently mocked at the penthouse gala. He had deliberately chosen this specific environment for their final confrontation. His historic home was a personal sanctuary, a place of peace they had violently tried to violate in the dead of night. This sleek, hyper-modern corporate office with its soundproof glass walls, biometric security checkpoints, and sweeping, unobstructed views of the financial district was an execution chamber. Jonathan waited in the expansive primary conference room, sorting a stack of impeccably organized legal folios at the head of a 20-foot polished mahogany table. Gregory took his seat opposite the reinforced double doors, resting his hands flat against the cold wood. He had agreed to this mediated meeting only to deliver the absolute final terms of their ruin in a highly controlled, legally observed environment. He signaled the front desk security team to grant the desperate couple access to the floor. When the heavy oak doors finally clicked open, the physical transformation was staggering. The polished, untouchable power couple who had confidently strode into the municipal family court anticipating an easy slaughter just days prior had completely evaporated. They shuffled into the conference room looking hollowed out, physically diminished, and utterly defeated. The grueling night spent in a freezing, unpowered mansion, coupled with the suffocating terror of absolute financial paralysis, had aged them a decade. Emily wore a wrinkled, oversized trench coat over a hastily chosen sweater, her perfectly manicured appearance replaced by dark, exhausted circles beneath her eyes and trembling hands. Jordan looked entirely broken. His shoulders slumped forward in defeat, his jaw was clenched tight with unchecked anxiety, and his legs visibly shook as he pulled out a heavy leather chair. They sat opposite Gregory, completely swallowed by the sheer scale of the mahogany table, looking less like corporate conquerors and more like convicted prisoners awaiting their final sentencing. The silence in the room, stretched out heavy and punishing, dictated entirely by Gregory's refusal to speak first. Jordan folded his hands on the table, cleared his dry throat, and broke. The arrogant, dismissive tone he had weaponized against his father for years was entirely gone, replaced by a frantic, breathless desperation. He pleaded for a comprehensive financial bailout. He spoke rapidly, stumbling over his words as he outlined a pathetic, groveling compromise. He promised that if Gregory simply lifted the Vanguard Holdings asset freezes and halted the impending foreclosure on the suburban estate, they would sign over any desired percentage of their future corporate earnings. He swore they would instantly dissolve the expedited divorce petition, claiming the marital fracture was merely a temporary, unfortunate symptom of extreme, uncharacteristic stress. Emily leaned forward, her voice a fragile, trembling whisper, completely abandoning the cold, glacial elitism she had weaponized at the country club. She attempted to play the devoted daughter-in-law, reaching across the wide table with an outstretched hand that Gregory completely ignored. She cried genuine tears of profound self-pity, insisting that they had simply lost their way, blinded by the aggressive demands of their social circle and the crushing weight of Jordan's failing corporate startup. They deployed every available emotional manipulation tactic they could muster in rapid succession. They invoked the sacred concept of family loyalty, insisting that blood dictated a fundamental obligation to forgive. Jordan begged his father to remember the early years, desperately attempting to conjure nostalgic memories of a childhood he had actively, aggressively abandoned in pursuit of wealth. He claimed that the brutal, terrifying reality of the past 72 hours had fundamentally changed him. He swore absolute, lifelong devotion to Gregory, promising to care for him daily, to integrate him fully into their lives, and to manage his legacy with unwavering respect and transparency. They painted themselves not as calculating predators who had aggressively orchestrated a massive commercial fraud, but as misguided, frightened children who had made a series of unfortunate mistakes under extreme corporate pressure. Emily sobbed openly, offering to publicly apologize to their entire social network to humiliate herself further if it meant regaining access to her frozen bank accounts. They offered total unconditional submission in exchange for basic financial mercy, waiting with bated breath for the elderly man across the table to soften to yield to their desperate, tearing pleas. Gregory watched their tearful, frantic performance without a single flicker of empathy. His expression remained entirely glacial, his posture perfectly still. When their breathless pleading finally exhausted itself, tapering off into pathetic, lingering sobs that echoed off the glass walls, Gregory slowly reached into the interior pocket of his tailored jacket. He did not produce a checkbook, a revised payment schedule, or a legal contract of forgiveness. He extracted a single, heavily creased document, unfolded it deliberately, and placed it precisely in the center of the polished mahogany table. He slid it across the smooth surface until it stopped directly between Jordan's trembling hands. It was the official notarized medical evaluation form, the exact document Jordan and Emily had illegally procured through a corrupted, highly paid physician to formally declare Gregory mentally incompetent. The precise paperwork they had intended to submit to a state judge to strip him of his civil liberties, seize his assets, and lock him away in a heavily restricted psychiatric facility. Gregory leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register that echoed with absolute authority. He instructed Jordan to read the document. Jordan stared down at the paper, the remaining color draining rapidly from his face. He shook his head frantically, his breathing accelerating as he refused to touch the page. Gregory did not raise his voice, but his command hardened into unbreakable steel. He ordered his son to read his own fabricated lies out loud on the strict legal record directly in front of the legal counsel present in the room. With a voice cracking under the crushing weight of utter humiliation, Jordan picked up the paper and began to read. He read the clinical descriptions of severe dementia, the entirely fabricated accounts of dangerous paranoia, and the false reports of violent, erratic behavior they had confidently invented to build their case. He read the detailed analytical lies claiming Gregory could no longer manage basic household tasks or comprehend simple financial decisions. He read the concluding paragraph, a chilling definitive recommendation for immediate involuntary institutionalization for the safety of the patient and the preservation of his estate. Every fabricated symptom, every medical lie designed to erase his father's autonomy, hung in the cold, sanitized air of the conference room. Gregory sat perfectly still, forcing them to physically verbalize the exact mechanism of the betrayal they had just attempted to dismiss as a simple, excusable mistake. The room fell dead silent as Jordan choked on the final damning sentence, dropping the paper back onto the table as if it burned his fingers. The fragile illusion of their potential reconciliation shattered completely. They realized with terrifying clarity that Gregory had not brought them here to negotiate a surrender or offer a lifeline. He had brought them here to force them to look directly into the abyss of their own cruelty before pushing them over the edge. The paper fluttered slightly as it settled on the polished wood. Gregory Sterling did not break his gaze. He sat perfectly straight, a monument of unyielding authority against the backdrop of the glittering city skyline. Jordan and Emily waited in the suffocating silence, their lungs burning as they anticipated the inevitable lecture. They expected the familiar parental dynamic where severe disappointment eventually gives way to a begrudging financial rescue. Gregory dismantled that expectation with a single precise movement. He folded his hands atop the table and began to outline the absolute mechanics of their survival. There would be no negotiation. There would be no mediation. He was not there to rescue their lifestyle. He was there to dictate the terms of their surrender. Gregory's voice remained perfectly level, devoid of anger or vindictiveness, which only amplified the terror it instilled. He acknowledged the criminal forgery that secured the Vanguard Holdings debt. He explicitly stated he would withhold the fabricated medical evaluation and the forged deed transfers from the district attorney. He would not personally send his only son to a federal penitentiary. However, that was the absolute limit of his paternal mercy. Vanguard Holdings as a corporate entity would not forgive a single fraction of the $500,000 commercial lien. Gregory ordered the immediate voluntary short sale of the sprawling suburban estate. The property was to be listed at a heavily discounted rate to ensure an immediate cash liquidation. Furthermore, their entire fleet of luxury vehicles was to be surrendered to a specialized auto broker before the close of business on Friday. Every dollar generated from the systematic dismantling of their hollow empire would be routed directly to Vanguard Holdings. They would not keep a single cent of equity. They would be left with zero liquid capital, zero credit, and zero assets. The sheer magnitude of the financial annihilation finally pierced Emily's shock. Her ingrained entitlement, nurtured by years of unchecked social climbing, instinctively flared. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning white, and attempted to negotiate the absolute minimum of her previous status. She argued that relinquishing both vehicles was entirely unreasonable. She claimed she required her imported luxury sedan to secure future employment, painting herself as a desperate victim of Jordan's overarching failure. She demanded the retention of one car as a basic necessity for survival, a microscopic concession to preserve a fraction of her dignity. Gregory did not entertain the argument. He did not raise his voice to counter her frantic logic. He simply reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored charcoal suit, retrieved his smartphone, and placed it face up on the polished wood. He informed Emily with glacial clarity that the district attorney's private cell phone number was currently programmed on his speed dial. He offered her a strictly binary choice. She could slide the keys to the sedan across the table at that exact moment, or he would unlock his phone and formally reinstate the felony forgery and elder abuse charges. He assured her that they would both leave the high-rise executive suite in the custody of armed municipal officers. The brutal, inescapable reality of a holding cell completely broke her remaining defiance. Emily unzipped her designer handbag with violently trembling fingers, retrieved the heavy silver key fob, and pushed it across the table until it rested against Gregory's phone. The surrender was total and unconditional. 4 weeks later, the punishing winter frost clung to the dead grass of the suburban estate. The massive 6-bedroom mansion, once a glittering monument to Jordan's aggressive corporate ego, stood entirely hollowed out. The aggressive short sale mandated by Gregory had been executed with ruthless efficiency. The imported Italian furniture, the custom artwork, and the high-end electronics had been seized and rapidly auctioned by corporate liquidators. Jordan and Emily stood in the freezing driveway, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They wore unbranded, practical winter coats, their designer wardrobes having been sold off to satisfy the remaining fractional debts. A battered, heavily dented moving truck sat idling on the asphalt, a stark contrast to the luxury vehicles that had previously occupied the space. Jordan hoisted a cheap cardboard box filled with basic kitchen supplies into the cavernous back of the truck. His hands were blistered and raw muscles aching from the grueling manual labor of packing their meager remaining possessions. The crushing $500,000 debt to Vanguard Holdings had technically been settled. The complete annihilation of their wealth had satisfied the corporate ledger. They had absolutely nothing left, but as Jordan slammed the heavy metal door of the truck down, he clung to the desperate consolation that he had at least retained his freedom. He had survived the blast radius of his own arrogance without wearing a federal prison uniform. The heavy iron security gates at the entrance of the cul-de-sac groaned loudly as they swung open. The sound was immediately followed by the aggressive crunch of tires on gravel. 2 municipal police cruisers turned sharply into the driveway, their red and blue emergency lights flashing silently against the gray, overcast sky. The vehicles boxed in the rented moving truck, strategically cutting off the only exit. 4 uniformed officers stepped out onto the frost-covered asphalt, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Jordan froze entirely, the heavy metal padlock slipping from his numb fingers and clattering loudly against the driveway. He stepped forward, his voice cracking in sudden renewed panic. He raised his hands defensively, shouting that the debt was paid in full. He loudly proclaimed that Vanguard Holdings had released the lien and that Gregory Sterling had explicitly promised not to press charges for the document forgery. The lead detective, a stocky man with a severely weathered face, approached Jordan with a manila folder in his hand. He did not slow his pace or offer a comforting demeanor. The detective stopped 2 feet away and informed Jordan with brutal bureaucratic efficiency that Gregory Sterling had indeed kept his word. The elderly man had never filed a formal complaint regarding the forged medical documents or the Vanguard Holdings acquisition. However, the detective explained the modern financial system possessed its own inescapable mechanisms. When Vanguard Holdings initiated the massive debt transfer to acquire the commercial bridge loan, the original issuing bank was legally obligated to conduct a comprehensive mandatory internal audit of the entire corporate file. That microscopic corporate review had easily uncovered the foundational amateur wire fraud Jordan had committed to secure his initial seed capital months prior. The original financial institution had bypassed Gregory entirely. They had submitted the felony fraud charges directly to the federal authorities. Jordan's breath caught in his throat as the absolute perfection of his father's trap finally materialized. Gregory had not needed to destroy him directly. By simply exposing Jordan's precarious financial structure to the harsh light of a corporate audit, Gregory had ensured his son's past crimes would inevitably detonate. The detective read Jordan his rights in a flat, practiced monotone. The officers stepped forward, twisting Jordan's arms behind his back and securing his wrists in cold, heavy steel handcuffs. Emily stood frozen by the cab of the rented truck, her face entirely devoid of color. She watched in absolute horrified silence as the officers shoved her husband into the back of the cruiser. The police vehicles reversed down the long driveway, leaving Emily standing completely alone on the freezing asphalt, holding the keys to a battered moving truck with absolutely nowhere to go. 6 months had passed since the flashing lights of the municipal police cruisers had fractured the bitter winter morning at Jordan and Emily's former estate. The brutal freezing frost had long since retreated, replaced by the lush, vibrant warmth of midsummer. The historic tree-lined street where Gregory Sterling resided was exceptionally quiet. The manicured lawns glowed a deep, healthy green under the late afternoon sun, and the thick canopy of ancient oak trees cast long, cooling shadows across the pavement. Gregory sat on his expansive wraparound porch, the solid wooden planks beneath his feet a testament to enduring craftsmanship. He held a ceramic mug of stark black coffee in his steady right hand. The steam curled upward, catching the golden sunlight before dissolving into the warm air. He wore a simple, impeccably pressed linen shirt and tailored trousers, completely at ease in the sanctuary he had fiercely protected. There were no frantic knocks at his heavy oak door. There were no calculated predatory ambushes disguised as familial visits. The neighborhood hummed with the gentle, rhythmic sounds of cicadas and distant lawnmowers, a symphony of ordinary, undisturbed suburban life. Gregory took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, appreciating the robust bitterness. The heavy, oppressive anxiety that had once clouded his days, the suffocating presence of his son's relentless greed had entirely evaporated. In its place was a profound, unshakable tranquility. He watched a pair of robins dart through the meticulously tended azalea bushes Cynthia had planted decades ago. The bushes were currently in full, magnificent bloom. The chaotic blast radius of Jordan and Emily's financial and legal detonation had not breached the property line of this historic home. Gregory had insulated his world perfectly, allowing the surrounding peace to rush back in and fill the void left by their banishment. The sharp, rhythmic crunch of heavy boots on the gravel driveway signaled the arrival of Daniel. The elite security operative approached the porch with his usual disciplined stride, carrying a thin, sealed manila folder. Daniel did not need to maintain a defensive perimeter anymore, but he had transitioned into a trusted confidant and primary liaison for Gregory's remaining corporate oversight. Gregory gestured to the empty wicker chair opposite him. Daniel sat down, opened the folder, and delivered the final comprehensive status report on the dispersed adversaries. The federal prosecutor had not shown a shred of leniency regarding the wire fraud. Jordan had aggressively attempted to negotiate a plea deal by offering to liquidate non-existent assets, completely failing to grasp the totality of his ruin. The federal judge had ultimately sentenced him to a mandatory 3-year term in a minimum security correctional facility, citing the sheer audacity and calculated nature of the financial deception. Jordan was currently serving his time stripped of his tailored suits, his leased luxury vehicles, and his insufferable corporate arrogance. He was assigned to the facility's laundry division, forced to meticulously clean the garments of the very demographic he had spent his entire adult life mocking and exploiting. Emily's trajectory was equally severe, though she had managed to avoid criminal indictment. Daniel reported that Vanguard Holdings had systematically squeezed every remaining drop of equity from her liquidated assets. Left with absolutely zero liquid capital and a ruined credit profile, she had fled the state in a desperate bid to outrun her social humiliation. The elite socialite who had once hosted lavish, champagne-drenched luncheons at the Sapphire Country Club was now residing in a cramped, un-air-conditioned studio apartment in a bleak industrial district 3 states away. To satisfy the remaining inescapable wage garnishments enforced by Vanguard's collection attorneys, Emily was currently working double shifts as a waitress at a high-volume late-night diner. She spent her nights carrying heavy trays of greasy food to demanding patrons, returning to her tiny apartment with aching feet and blistered hands. Gregory listened to Daniel's precise, objective recitation of these facts without a single flicker of vindictive joy. He did not smile at the image of his former daughter-in-law scrubbing tables, nor did he celebrate his son's incarceration. He simply absorbed the reality of their current existence. They had survived the collapse of their fraudulent empire. They were not destroyed, but they were fundamentally dismantled. The parasitic entitlement that had defined their entire identities had been forcefully eradicated. They were now being educated in the agonizing, unyielding reality of honest manual labor. The lesson they had so aggressively avoided learning through his quiet example was now being mandated by federal judges and corporate debt collectors. Gregory closed the folder and handed it back to Daniel with a firm nod of finality. The ledger was officially closed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of violet and bruised orange, Gregory stood from his wicker chair and walked back inside his historic home. The interior air was cool and exceptionally still. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace through the vaulted foyer and stepped into the formal dining room. The heavy brass chandelier cast a warm, golden glow over the massive mahogany table dominating the center of the room. Gregory slowly reached out, tracing his weathered hand over the smooth, polished wood. This was the exact physical space where the ultimate betrayal had been conceptualized, the table where Jordan had sat and coldly lied to his face while plotting his institutionalization. The wood held no lingering toxicity. The room had been thoroughly cleansed of their malice. Gregory's gaze lifted from the mahogany surface and settled on a silver-framed photograph resting on the antique credenza. It was a picture of his late wife Cynthia, taken during a summer vacation decades prior. Her bright, intelligent eyes smiled back at him, radiating a warmth and fundamental decency that Jordan had tragically failed to inherit. Gregory looked at her image and felt a profound, settling peace anchor his soul. He realized with absolute clarity that he had not destroyed his family. He had not initiated the betrayal, the forgery, or the deceit. He had merely stepped aside and permitted the unforgiving consequences of their own boundless greed to dismantle their carefully constructed illusions. They had built a towering house of cards, and he had simply refused to continue shielding them from the wind. He turned away from the dining room and walked into his private study, the very room where he had meticulously orchestrated Vanguard Holdings' stealth acquisition. He crossed the Persian rug and sank into the deep, worn leather of his favorite reading chair. The leather creaked softly, welcoming his weight. He reached to the side table, picked up a heavy leather-bound novel, and opened it to a marked page. He adjusted his reading glasses, letting his eyes adjust to the text. The house around him was entirely devoid of conflict, deception, or desperate pleas for unearned capital. Gregory Sterling took a deep, steady breath, surrounded by the absolute, unyielding, and magnificent silence of a life fully reclaimed. Did you enjoy this final chapter of the story? Which part of Gregory's strategic defense resonated with you the most? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Please like, subscribe, and share to support the channel and help us bring more incredible life stories directly to you.